Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 1. My Uncle, the Professor. On the 24th of May, 1863, my uncle, Professor Liedenbrock, rushed into our little house in Königstrasse, which is one of the oldest parts of Hamburg. "Mr. Liedenbrock came home so soon," cried Martha, our cook. "Why has the master come so early?" "Perhaps he will tell us himself," I said. Poor Martha has not yet cooked the meal. As she did not want to be present in the room while my uncle started arguing with me, she left. But how was I to argue with a man as irascible as my uncle? In order to avoid the situation, I hurried away to my room upstairs. I heard the professor rapidly entering his study through the dining room. "Axel, follow me!" he cried. Without losing any time to let him shout at me, I rushed into my master's study room. I would like to remark that Otto Liedenbrock is not a bad man, but he has a very original character. My uncle was a professor at Johannum, giving lectures on mineralogy. During the course of each course, he would passionately instruct the students. However, the improvement of his class, or their attention listening to him, would not be a matter of concern to my uncle. He never troubled himself with such trivial matters. With all the information he gave, he would benefit himself first, not others. Nevertheless, I primarily wish to assert that my uncle was a very learned man. The genius of a true geologist and the keen eye of a mineralogist converged in him. With his hammer, steel pointer, magnetic needles, blowpipe, and his bottle of nitric acid, he was a man of science. Among 600 enumerated elementary substances, he would refer any mineral to its proper place. All of these minerals were grouped according to their fracture, appearance, hardness, fusibility, soreness, smell, and taste. His colleagues and learned societies honorably mentioned his name, Liedenbrock. Famous scientists of the age always called upon him on their way through Hamburg. Furthermore, they consulted my uncle on the most complicated problems in chemistry. As a scientist, my uncle served chemistry by making considerable discoveries. In 1853, my uncle produced a folio entitled A Treatise upon Transcendental Chemistry. However, this work did not cover its expenses. In addition to all these, allow me to add that my uncle was the curator of the Museum of Mineralogy, which was formed by Russian Armour. The museum is of great importance and well known around Europe. As for the physical appearance of the professor, he is tall and thin. His unrestful eyes continuously move behind his spectacles. He is 50 years old. He kept his fists firmly closed while walking, which is a sign of fretful temperament. We lived in my uncle's own home in Hamburg. The professor was tolerably well off for a German professor. The house was his own, with everything in it. The household is his goddaughter, Groben, a young beautiful girl of 17, Martha, our cook, and me. As his orphan nephew, I became his laboratory assistant. I was personally fond of mineralogy, and the other related fields, too. I had a mineralogist's blood in my veins, and I was happy among all our specimens and books. Despite my uncle's impatience, the life in Königstrasse was good, and we lived happily. Although he was a little excitable, he loved me very much. My uncle had no idea of waiting. He has a fitful, impatient nature. So I fled into his room. The professor's study was just like a museum. Specimens of mineralogy were correctly named, divided into minerals in terms of their qualities. I knew all these bits of science so well. Dusting these graphites, anthracites, coals, lignite, and peat was more enjoyable for me than the company of my friends. We had bitumen, resins, and organic salts to be protected from dust. When I entered the study, I only thought of my uncle. I forgot all other things. I saw that he was sitting on a chair with a book in his hand. "This is a remarkable book. What a wonderful book!" he exclaimed. I knew well that my uncle had a tendency of bibliomania, but this old book must have been a special value for him. "I found the priceless treasure in a rummage sale in old Hevelius's shop," he said. "Magnificent," I replied, as if I was enthusiastic. "Look," he went on, "isn't it beautiful? Splendid! It opens and shuts easily. What about the cover? After 700 years, it is in good condition." While my uncle opened and shut the book during his praises, I was indifferent and uninterested, yet I had to keep the conversation going on. "What is the title of this marvelous book?" I asked. "This work is the Heimskringla of Snorre Sturluson, the most famous Icelandic author of the 12th century. It is the chronicle of the Norwegian princes who ruled in Iceland," he replied. When I asked him if it was a German translation, he lost temper. "A translation? What should I do with a translation? This is an Icelandic original, which is both rich and simple. Icelandic possesses a variety of grammatical and verbal combinations." He went on talking about the similarities between Icelandic, Latin, and Greek. Then I asked him the type of the book. "What? What do you mean, Axel? It is a manuscript, an original runic manuscript," he cried. "Runic?" "Yes," he said, and told me about it. "Runic characters were used in Iceland in former ages. Come here, look at this and admire the letters." At that time, a piece of paper slipped out of the book and fell upon the floor. "What is this?" cried my uncle, picking up the paper swiftly. He put the paper on the table. There were mysterious characters on it. In fact, these letters were of great importance for signaling the greatest expedition ever made. However, at that time, they were not able to understand it. The characters were completely indefinable to us. "These are runic letters. They are the same in the book. But what does it mean?" muttered my uncle after examining the paper for a few minutes. I must add that the professor is very successful in languages. He could speak 200 languages and 12,000 dialects which are spoken on the earth. At last, it seemed that he would decode these strange characters. I was sure that he would certainly work on it until it was decoded. When the clock struck 2 o'clock, I was preparing for the meal. At that moment, Martha stepped by the door and said that the meal was ready. I passed to the dining room and got seated at the dinner table, not knowing what would happen soon. I waited for a few minutes. I was surprised to see that the professor was for the first time late for the meal. Would all this food be sacrificed for a bit of paper? I ate both for myself and my uncle. "I have never seen this before," said Martha. "Professor Liedenbrock is not at the table. Something serious is happening," she said with concern. I was about to finish my dessert when a loud voice shook me. I rushed into my uncle's study. "This is certainly runic," he said, examining the paper closely. "But there is a secret on it, and I am determined to discover it." "Sit here and write," he cried with a violent gesture. "I will dictate you every letter of our alphabet which corresponds with each of these Icelandic letters. Let us try." When dictation came to an end, the following result came out. "What does it mean?" he said mechanically, and went on. "This is a cryptogram, or cipher. The letters are confused on purpose. If they are properly arranged, you can decipher the secret message. What if this cipher was a key to an amazing discovery?" I didn't think that there was an important thing in it, but of course I kept my ideas to myself. "These two writings are not written by the same hand," he said. "The writing on the book belongs to a former time. There are 200 years between the manuscript and the document. Because the letter double M, which is the first letter of the document, was added to the alphabet in the 14th century, the professor's conclusion seemed really logical to me. For this reason, a person who wrote this book before wrote this mysterious parchment. But who was that? Maybe we can find his name somewhere on the manuscript," he said. Then he took a strong lens and carefully examined the book. On the second page he found a stain which looked like an ink blot. Looking closely at the stain, he distinguished some letters. He then worked on the stain, and by the help of his microscope, he sorted it out. "Arne Saknusemem!" he cried violently. "He is an Icelander, a savant of the 16th century, a famous alchemist. The alchemists like Avicenna, Bacon, Lully, and Pericles were the greatest ones of their age. Their discoveries were very surprising. This Saknussemm must have concealed something very important under this cryptogram. My uncle's typical enthusiasm was about to come out, and he showed this with his crazy decision. I will find out the secret of this document, and I will not sleep or eat until I find it out. Nor you, Axel. Oh, God, I said. I am lucky because I have eaten 2 dinners today. We must solve this cipher, he said, and began to list methods, which all seemed logical to me. Saknussemm was not writing in Icelandic, so he would have to have chosen to write in Latin. Maybe we can try Spanish, French, Italian, Greek, or Hebrew, but the savants of the 16th century generally wrote in Latin. Therefore, we will start with Latin, he said. We sat to work together. First, he took the leaf that I wrote on and tried to figure out the arrangement. Series of 132 letters were in disorder. What is the key? Axel, have you understood it? As my eyes met with a splendid portrait of Groban, I didn't reply. My uncle's ward, Groban, was now at Altona, staying with a relative. Her absence was a source of grief to me, because I can tell you a secret that Groban and I, well, we love each other. Moreover, we are engaged, which was unknown to my uncle. How beautiful she was! I simply adored her. She was also my assistant. Being a successful mineralogist, she every day helped me to arrange my specimens. We had very pleasant times in the study. We had leisure time. We used to walk hand in hand in the streets of Hamburg. Just in the middle of my dream, my uncle interrupted. We should write the words vertically instead of horizontally, he said. Indeed, I replied. Now, get a paper and write a sentence on it, but arrange the letters in succession in vertical columns so we can group them in 5 or 6 vertical lines, he said. Good. Now set these words in horizontal line. This was the result. Ilauolorb our Nurmia? This looks like an ancient document, too. In order to read this, I will take the first letter of each word, then second, third, and fourth. The professor attentively worked on the paper for a few minutes. Then he deciphered my sentence and read it aloud. I love you well, my own dear Groban. He read in a great astonishment. Without thinking that my smart uncle would read this, I announced my secret love to Groban, my uncle. You love Groban? Now let's apply this method to our parchment, he went on. His eyes flashed with eagerness and his fingers began to cover. What he found was... That's not it, cried the professor. It is senseless. He quickly got out of the room and left the house. Chapter 2. Obstinacy of my uncle. He has gone! What about his dinner? Cried Martha. He can't have any, I replied. She was struck with surprise. He won't eat. No one in the house will eat anything until the professor succeeds in deciphering a complicated paper. Martha returned to the kitchen talking to herself. When I was alone, I thought to go to my Groban and tell her, but my uncle might return at any moment. And what if he called me? I had to remain in the house and avoid any argument, so I set to work in the study and classified, labeled, and arranged minerals. But this wasn't enough to keep my attention, so I fetched the paper and sat on the chair. What does it all mean? I asked myself. I tried to group the letters to form words. Nonsense! I tried them in 2s, 3s, 5s, or 6s. Nothing. On the 14th, 15th, or 16th letter, 2 words, ice, came out. In 83rd and 2, sir, and in second line, rota, mutable, ira, ni, and atro came up. In the following lines, New French, Latin, and Hebrew words showed up. 4 different languages in stupid sentence. What does all this wood, mother, bow, and sea mean? My brain got heated. My eyes filled with water. I was tired, and I needed air. I fanned myself with the ancient paper. To my surprise, in one of the rapid movements, I saw a Latin word, crater, terrestre, and others. I had discovered the key to the cipher. All of those combinations were coming right. Without hesitation, I read the whole sentence aloud. Stupefaction! Terror! Has any human being actually done this? But no, my uncle should not know this. This is absolutely crazy. My uncle should not see this, otherwise he'll insist upon doing this. Such a determined geologist like him, I can't stop him from doing it. Now I must prevent him from knowing this forever. So I came close to the fireplace with the parchment in my hand. I was just about to drop it in the fire when my uncle violently came in. I quickly replaced the parchment on the table. The professor sat on his chair and began to apply new combinations, which looked like an algebraic formula. His hands were shaking. Could he find the key by himself? Holding the key in my hands, I was trembling too. My poor uncle worked on those formulations without lifting his head for a moment. I began to feel like a hero, being able to solve the mystery before the professor. Time was passing away. My uncle was still struggling when Martha came and asked if we would have supper tonight, but she was unanswered. After a long resistance, I was unable to keep myself awake, so I slept on the sofa while my uncle kept trying his methods. The next morning I found the professor working on the paper when I woke up. His eyes were red, his face was pale. To tell the truth, I felt sorry for my uncle. The idea kept him so busy that he'd even forgotten how to get angry. Should I tell him that I found the key? No, certainly not. He would insist on going. Nothing could stop him. Meanwhile, our good Martha wanted us to go for the market, and found out that the door was locked. Of course it was my uncle. Did he want to leave us to famine? Why Martha and I were victims, although we had nothing to do with that stupid document. I was too hungry. In addition, I wanted to get out of the house. How could I stand not seeing Groben for a long time? It was 2:00 now, and the matter was getting ridiculous. I could not bear the situation. After thinking for a while, I condemned myself for waiting so long. The professor seized his hat and got on his feet. "Uncle!" I cried. He did not even hear me. "Uncle, that key!" "What key? The door key?" he said. "No, the key to the document." He stared at me without saying a word for a while. "What do you mean?" he shouted with great emotion. "There, read that," I said, presenting the paper which I had written. I read it from the end to the beginning. "Aha! Clever Saknussemm," he cried. "You had written the sentence the wrong way. In SNEFELL's joculis craterum quem dilabat umbras cateris Juli intra calans descende audivirtore et terrestre centrum matiges quod feci arne Saknussemm." It means, "Descend, bold traveler, into the crater of Jokul, of SNEFELL, which the shadow of Scartaris touches before the calends of July, and you will attain the center of the earth, which I have done, Arne Saknussemm." While reading this, my uncle's eyes sparkled with joy. He walked up and down the room with great emotion. When his nerves calmed down, he asked the hour, and said that we could now have dinner. "After dinner, pack up my trunk." "What?" I cried. "And pack up yours," he ejaculated. "Penetrate to the center of the earth? It's nonsense," I shivered, but controlled myself and focused on my dinner only. "Axel," said my uncle when we got to his room after the dinner, "you are an ingenious young man. I will never forget it. You have done a splendid service. Now you will have a share in the greatest discovery we will make. But I am planning to keep this a secret. In the scientific world, some people can envy me, and they would be ready to make this discovery before us." I personally did not believe that there were many bold people, but my uncle was sure that if any of the other scientists found the document, they would follow the directions. "But we have no proof of the authenticity of the document," said I. "I admit that Saknussemm may have written it, but it does not mean that he has really accomplished this journey." "That is what we shall see," he said. "Ah," I protested. "Let me tell you my objections to this journey." "Well, boy, go on. Do not be afraid. You are not only a nephew, but also my colleague now." "Well, I would like to know, what does Jokul, Sneffel, and Skartaris mean?" He said that this was an easy question and told me to get an atlas from the shelf. "Here is one of the best maps of Iceland. Look at this volcanic island. All of the volcanoes are called Jokuls. That means glacier in Icelandic. Thus, this term is applied for all eruptive mountains in Iceland." "What about Sneffel?" "Here's Reykjavik, the capital, and here is the mountain Sneffel. It is one of the most remarkable volcanoes. Its crater leads to the center of the earth." "That is impossible," I shrugged my shoulders. "This crater must be filled with lava and burning rocks." "But suppose it is an extinct volcano. Sneffel is one of the extinct volcanoes. Since prehistoric times, there has only been one eruption in 1291. From that time, it quieted down." To such positive explanations, I could not make any reply. "So, what does Skartaris mean, and what is the relation between the kalends of July?" "Well, Sneffels has several craters. For this reason, he pointed out to the accurate one. Kalends of July means the last day of July. At that time, one of its peaks, Skartaris, casts a shadow on the mouth of this particular crater." My uncle had answered all my objections, so I passed on scientific objections. "Well, I see that Saknussemm's sentence is clear, and leaves no room for doubt. All these theories can be true. But as for reaching there himself, did he ever go there? We must learn this first." My uncle was laughing at me, but I went on. "It is known for sure that the internal temperature rises 1 degree for 70 feet in depth. There must be a temperature of 360,032 degrees at the center of the earth. Therefore, all the substances found there must be in a state of gas. I see logical reasons for not going there. We would need to reach a depth of 30 miles. The temperature must be 2,372 degrees there." "I will tell you that true savants and other distinguished geologists believe that the interior of the earth is neither gas nor water. I discussed it with my distinguished colleagues. We agreed that the structure of the terrestrial nucleus cannot be in liquid state, because liquid mass would be exposed to lunar attraction and cause tightening." When I objected with a contrary thesis, he went on. "The earth has been heated by combustion in its surface, that is all. The condition of terrestrial nucleus gave rise to several hypotheses among geologists. There is no proof for internal heat. My opinion is that there is no such thing. We will see ourselves." "We will see," I replied, shivering. "But certainly keep it silent. No one before us will discover the center of the earth." Chapter 3. The Journey. After that memorable conversation, I threw myself to the streets of Hamburg. I was stunned. Would we really travel to the center of the earth? It was absurd. No sensible man would dare such a journey. I followed the banks of the Elbe, passed the port, and reached Altona. Then I saw my little Groben. "Axel," she cried in surprise, "have you come to meet me?" When she looked at me, she quickly understood the uneasiness and distress on my mind. I shortly informed her about my uncle's plans. To my surprise, she said, "Axel, that would be a splendid journey. A journey like this will make you both distinguished savants." "What? Groben, won't you dissuade me?" "No, Axel. I would willingly come with you if I could." I was disconcerted, and to tell the truth, I was ashamed. Groben was more courageous than me. I arrived home late at night. I was expecting to see the house in its routine way. How could I forget my uncle's impatience? He was shouting and working among the porters and messengers. "Come, Axel, you miserable wretch," he cried to me. "Your boxes are not packed. Where are my papers and keys?" I was struck with surprise. He had already begun preparations. "Are we really going?" "Of course. The day after tomorrow, We are off." After an awful night, Groban tried to comfort me in the morning. "I had a long talk with the professor. He is a great philosopher, you know. My dear Axel, it is a grand thing to devote yourself to science. You will be honored when you turn back. When you return, Axel, you will be free to do what you want." My Groban blushed. I took her to the professor's study. There I learnt that the journey to Iceland would take time, and there was only one trip every month. We would sail off from Copenhagen to Reykjavik on the 22nd of June. If we waited beyond the 22nd, we would be too late to see the shadow of Skartris fall on the crater of SNEFELL. "Therefore be quick, and get ready at once," cried my uncle. I went up to my room with Groban. She helped me pack my things. The next morning, I found my uncle at the breakfast table. At 5:30, a carriage came to take us to Altona. "Be quick and get your pack," said the professor, "or we will miss the train." When parting time came, Groban could not help a tear fall down on her beautiful cheeks. "Go, dear Axel. I am now your betrothed. When you come back, I will be your wife. I will be waiting for you." We took our seats at the carriage and waved goodbye to Groban and Martha. From Altona we passed to Holstein. At 6:30 we stopped at the station where my uncle's packages were removed, labelled, weighed, and put into luggage vans. Half an hour later we got on the train. My uncle kept his ancient document in a secret pocket in his portfolio. He also had a sheet of paper from the consul of Hamburg. He wrote some instructions to the governor of Iceland. We passed Kiel and Cursor before setting foot in Copenhagen. At 10 in the morning we reached Copenhagen and went to our hotel. After a quick toilet stop, my uncle went to the Museum of North Antiquities. The curator of this museum, Professor Thomsen, was a friend of Danish consul at Hamburg. My uncle had written a cordial letter to him. Mr. Thomsen helped us find a vessel to Iceland. I was hoping not to find a vessel, but on the 2nd of June, a small schooner would sail to Reykjavik. After settling these matters, we had breakfast and took a trip to the city. When we arrived at the church, my uncle recommended going to the top. The church had an external staircase around the spire, circling up into the sky. I protested for being dizzy, but of course he ignored. He went ahead of me and I followed. As the stairs ascended, I felt dizzy. At the top, my uncle urged me to look down. This would be our first practice and first lesson of height. For 5 days in succession, we repeated this exercise. The day before our departure, Mr. Thomsen brought us a letter of introduction to the governor of Iceland and the mayor of Reykjavik. On the 2nd, we sailed. My uncle was so impatient that he assured that the wind was favorable. The voyage would take days from Copenhagen to Reykjavik. As my uncle was ill throughout the voyage, he did not show up on board much. Instead, he preferred to stay in his cabin. On arriving in Faxa Bay before Reykjavik, my uncle came out of his cabin. Before leaving the deck, he pointed to a distant mount. "SNEFELL! SNEFELL!" Then he instructed me to keep silent. The governor of Iceland met us. The professor gave him his letters from Copenhagen, and after a short conversation, Mr. Thomsen said that he was ready to be at the service of Professor Lidenbrock. The mayor, Mr. Finsen, received my uncle just as courteously. Mr. Fredrickson, professor of natural sciences, was a friendly man too. Then my uncle went to the library for further investigation of Saknussemm, and I decided to take a tour in the city. The town was not very big. The longest 2 streets were parallel to the sea. Merchants and traders were living here. I saw the governor's house, a church, a national school in which Hebrew, English, French, and Danish were taught, just as I learned. The general scene was not interesting. There were no trees at all. I met a few people. They were busy putting fish on board. After the walk, I returned to Mr. Fredrickson's house, where my uncle was staying. Chapter 4. We reach Iceland. At dinner, we had a scientific conversation with Mr. Fredrickson. As I did not know Danish, their speaking German and Latin was not for my benefit. During the conversation, my uncle kept gesturing to me for not giving a clue about our plans. Mr. Fredrickson asked if my uncle was successful in the library. My uncle replied that their library was quite deserted. Then Mr. Fredrickson informed us that they had 8,000 volumes, which are rare and valuable. To our surprise, he said that all the people in the icy region were fond of reading. These volumes were passing from one to another all over the country. "What could be stranger?" asked my uncle. "If you be kind enough to tell me what books you hope to find, I may perhaps make them available for you," he said kindly. "Mr. Fredrickson, I was wondering if you possessed any of the works of Arne Saknussemm." "Arne Saknussemm?" replied Mr. Fredrickson. "You mean the 16th century learned savant, chemist, naturalist, and traveler? One of the greatest of Iceland, who was brave and a genius?" "Quite so," my uncle replied. "We do not have his work," said Mr. Fredrickson. "Why?" "Because Arne Saknussemm was persecuted for heresy, and in 1573 his books were burned." "Excellent!" ejaculated my uncle, to great surprise of Mr. Fredrickson. "Now I understand why he hid his great discoveries in complicated cryptogram." When Mr. Fredrickson asked what he meant by these ejaculations, my uncle quickly reversed the subject. He asked if he was late for the discoveries, and the Icelandic professor replied that many researchers had arrived there for scientific purposes, but he assured him that many scientific discoveries were left. "There are many mountains, glaciers, and volcanoes to explore and study. For example, that mountain in the horizon SNEFELL." "Ah, is that SNEFELL?" asked my uncle, pretending to be cool. "Yes, that has scarcely been visited. It is extinct for more than 500 years. My uncle tried to seem innocent and said that we would try to scale SNEFELL and maybe pursue our studies in its crater. Mr. Fredrickson kindly announced that he would not be joining us due to his engagements. "Oh, no, we do not disturb anyone. We appreciate your kind services." "In that volcano you will make very interesting observations, Mr. Liedenbrock. But how do you plan to reach the peninsula of SNEFELL?" "By the sea, that is the shortest cut." "It is impossible, because we do not have any boats at Reykjavik. Therefore you will have to go by land. It takes longer, but is more interesting." "Well, I will need a guide," said my uncle. "I have a safe, intelligent man who is very clever, and who can speak Danish perfectly. Tomorrow you can see him." The next morning I woke up to find my uncle talking to a tall man in Danish. Soon I understood that this was our guide. This strong, blue-eyed man was called Hans Bjelke, and he was recommended by Mr. Fredrickson. His manners were just in contrast with that of my uncle's. Movements of this native man were very confined. He did not bother to use his hands during conversations. He did not show any kind of mimic in his countenance. While listening to my uncle, he just moved his head from left to right to express no, and bended his head slightly to express yes. His movements were so slight that his long hair did not even move at all. I felt that nothing in this world could surprise this calm, tranquil character. Nevertheless, my irascible uncle and this calm man came to understand each other. As for the payment, Hans was ready to accept what my uncle offered, and my uncle was ready to give whatever Hans demanded. According to the treaty, Hans would receive his wages on every Saturday at 6 o'clock in the evening. We concluded that Hans would take us to the village Stapi at the foot of the SNEFELL. By land, it would take 7 or 8 days. We had 4 horses. 2 would carry me, the professor, and the other would carry our baggage. Hans would go on foot, as was his custom. He knew all the parts of the coast perfectly, and promised to take us the shortest way. However, his service would not end with taking us to Stapi. He would accompany my uncle during the whole period of his scientific researches, which means he would also go to the center of the earth. The start was on 16th of June, and we had 2 days before departure. I was busy with preparations of our instruments during this time. Our instruments were 1. A centigrade thermometer graduated up to 150 degrees Celsius. It would be too much if the internal heat was to rise so high, which means we would be baked, and it was not enough to measure the temperature of the springs in a state of fusion. 2. An aneroid barometer. An ordinary barometer would not work as well, as the pressure would increase during our descending to the point. 3. A chronometer. 4. 2 compasses. 5. A night glass. 6. 2 rum corpse apparatuses which supply safe and hand-portable light. As for the arms, my uncle took 2 rifles and 2 pistols, which I thought were unnecessary. The tools comprised of 2 pickaxes, 2 spades, a silk rope ladder, 3 iron-tipped sticks, a hatchet, a hammer, a dozen wedges, iron spikes, and a long knotted rope. For the provisions, we had beef and biscuits, enough for 6 months. We did not take any water, because my uncle was determined to find springs, despite all my objections. Our traveling accompaniments also included a pocket of medicine chests, which contained scissors, splints for broken limbs, tape and unbleached lines, bandages, compresses, lint, laced for bleeding, dextrin, alcoholic ether, liquid acetate of lead, vinegar, and ammonia drugs. My uncle also added a supply of tobacco, coarse grain powder, gold, paper and silver money, 6 pairs of waterproof shoes. So, the 14th of June was spent with arranging our articles. On the 15th June, our preparations were all made. Our host gave the professor a very precious document for a mineralogist, a map of Iceland, which was quite detailed. After a restless night, when I awoke the next morning, I saw Hans and my uncle getting ready for the journey. We bade goodbye to Mr. Fredrickson and set off. The weather was calm and favorable. On horseback I was caught by the idea of freedom and desire. In this unknown land I was enjoying the pleasure of the trip. On the other hand, I was assuring myself with the idea that even if the idea of going to the center of the earth through a passage is all nonsense, I could enjoy this strange trip. Hans moved ahead of us with a rapid pace. On learning Reykjavik, Hans took us by the seashore. The country was almost a desert. We passed pastures which looked yellow rather than green. In this country there were not any roads, nor paths. This part of the province was considered among the inhabited and cultivated portions of Iceland. With so scarce vegetation, we only saw a few farm buildings. I could not imagine the rest of the country. What would other regions which were exposed to volcanic eruptions and subterranean convulsions look like? I had no idea of the spectacle waiting for us on the peninsula of SNEFELL. In 2 hours from Reykjavik, we halted in Alkirkede, a principal church. Hans rested for half an hour and had breakfast. Our next arrival place was Gardar. After 3 hours, we arrived at Kolla Fjord and entered into a parish called Julberg. Our horses waited there. Then we went on to the south shore of Halfjord. Farha, said Hans, pointing to a boat, but he said that we have to wait for the tide. At 6 o'clock, when the favorable tide came, we got on a raft with 2 other passengers and 4 horses. It took more than an hour, and we reached Gardar after another half an hour. Chapter 5. Snefell at last. In Iceland, during June and July, the sun does not set, so we could not know the time for sure. As for the weather, it was quite low. I was cold and hungry. For this reason, the sight of the farm was a relief to me. When we arrived at the farm, the host met us with hospitality. We followed him into our apartment, which was a large room with a small window. To tell the truth, I was not expecting such comfort. Our beds were a dry litter inside 2 wooden frames. Our host greeted us again when we entered the room where the fire was lighted. He and his wife met us with warm salverte, meaning be happy. Every now and then I noticed foul-haired children popping out of the rooms. I want to note that this kind of family has 19 children. My uncle and I quickly got on well with these little ones. At the dinner table, we were 24 people. We had kids on our laps and shoulders, and devoured the meal in silence. The host served us soup made of lichen, dried fish floating in butter, clotted milk with biscuits, and a drink prepared with juniper berries. For beverage we had this milk mixed with water. I was very hungry, so I did not think about the quality of this diet too much. After dinner, the children disappeared, and everyone went to their own rooms. The next morning, we set out on the road early, after bidding goodbye to our kind host. My uncle did not forget to give a sum of money. As we got near the desert, became wider and more hideous, the sail began to change and become less favorable to progress. There was not even a tree, only a few small birches. I felt melancholy in this surrounding. We passed a few narrow fjords, a wide gulf, and passed over without delay when the tide was high. We reached Alfjords. Next day, after spending the night in a deserted building, we traveled along bogs, dead leaves, melancholy desert tracks. By nightfall we reached Trospolt. On the 19th of June, we walked upon hardened lava, which in this country was called Huron. The surface looked like distorted, twisted cables. There were a few jets of streams from hot springs here and there, yet we had to continue on our way. We proceeded westward. The twin peaks of SNEFELL rose white into the sky ahead of us. At 6 p.m. on June 20th, we reached Buder, a village by the sea. Here, Hans demanded his wages. In this village, Hans' own family, his uncles and cousins, kindly received us. The next morning, the sail gave signals of the structure of a mountain. We were rounding the immense base of the volcano. The professor could not believe his eyes as we got nearer to Stapi, and said, "There stands the giant I shall conquer." Stapi is a village of 30 huts built of lava at the south of SNEFELL. The village presents often surprising forms of basalt. Here and there we could see irregular pyramids, imperfectly formed cones with fantastic shapes. We arrived at Rector's house, and after meeting him, we went to our rooms. The visitors' rooms seemed worse than the whole cabin. It was small, dirty, and there was a bad smell, but we had to be content. My uncle quickly discovered the personality of the rector. I do not want to say anything bad for the poor priest, but instead of a good and learned man, we found a rude and coarse man. Therefore, we decided to start the grand expedition as soon as possible. The next day, preparations were quickly done. 3 Icelanders were hired to carry our burdens until we reached the crater. Meanwhile, my uncle explained to Hans that he had the intention of exploring the interior of the volcano to its farthest limits. Hans only nodded. He was indifferent to any kind of situation, whether on the surface or under the bowels of the earth. As for me, it was too late to resist my uncle at this time, under these circumstances. I was alarmed by one thought. What would happen if the volcano wakes up again? Now, we were to explore the crater of it, and if there is a way to reach the center of the earth, we could lose our way too. This idea was so disturbing that I was courageous enough to discuss it with the professor. "I was thinking of that," he replied. "Ever since we arrived at Stapi, I was busy with the idea. For 600 years, SNEFELL has been extinct. For this reason, I examined native people. I have studied external structure. Be calm, Axel. There will be no eruption. Come, follow me." I obeyed and followed him. The professor took a straight road into an opening in the basaltic wall, led away from the sea. Now we were in an open place. This tract seemed crushed under a rain of enormous ejected rocks of trap, basalt, granite, and other rocks. There were puffs and jets of steam curling up into the air. "When an eruption approaches, these jets redouble their activity, but disappear during eruption," said my uncle, again beating me with the weapons of science. On the 23rd of June, the next day, Hans was waiting for us, completing all the necessary preparations. He did not forget to add water, which would supply us for 8 days. At 9 in the morning, the priest charged an unexpectedly heavy bill, and my uncle paid it without a remark. A man who would penetrate to the center of the earth would not mind such cases. SNEFELL is 5,000 feet high and has 2 snowy cones. We walked in a line headed by Hans. After passing the basaltic wall of the fjord of Stapi, we passed ancient vegetation of the peninsula. As an ardent mineralogist and a true nephew of Otto Lidenbrock, I observed these mineralogical curiosities with interest. Iceland was wholly composed of volcanic tufa, which was then formed by eruptions. We were walking over grey racks which formed hexagonal prisms after being cooled on the surface of the earth. The way was getting more and more arduous. The ascent grew steeper and steeper, and loose rocks trembled beneath our feet. After 3 hours walking, we had only arrived at the base of the mountain. We halted for a hasty breakfast. My uncle swallowed 2 mouthfuls of food in order to continue faster. However, we halted for an hour until our guide was pleased to move. The other 3 Icelanders never spoke and ate in silence, as their comrade Hans did. After breakfast, we began to ascend the steep side of the mountain. Beneath our feet, stones rolled away as we stepped on. At some places it was impossible to climb the flanks of the mountain. We helped each other with our sticks. My uncle kept as close as possible to me, and he never lost sight of me. When I stumbled, he supported me with his arms. After the difficult ascent on unfavorable structures, fortunately, a kind of staircase appeared between 2 peaks. The steepness increased, but thanks to these stone steps, we climbed with rapidity. As we penetrated upwards, the air got cooler. The wind was violently blowing, and we were exhausted. Despite all his impatience, my uncle told Hans to stop when he saw my fatigue. "Mistur," replied Hans. "Ja, mistur," said one of the Icelanders. "Look," said my uncle. An immense column of pulverized pumice, sand, and dust was rising with a whistling circular motion. The wind was lashing it to one side of the mountain. "Hastlig! Hastlig!" cried Hans. He began to climb round the crater. Meanwhile the dust storm fell upon the mountain. The stones loosened and quivered under the shock. Fortunately, we were on the opposite side of the mountain, and only harm was that our bodies were bruised and mangled. As a result of precautions that our guide had taken, we were saved. We continued our zigzag climb for hours. I was so hungry and tired that I could no longer stand it. At last, at 11 o'clock, we reached the summit of the SNEFELL. Chapter 6. We are going down. We rapidly ate our supper and went to bed, which was undoubtedly hard, yet I slept quite well on the rough ground. The next morning, we were half frozen by the sharp air. I got up from my granite bed and enjoyed the magnificent spectacle. There were numberless glaciers, snowy peaks, and a vast plain lying in front of my eyes. On the westward, the ocean lay with all of its excellence. With these pleasures of elevations, I was forgetting who I was and where I was. I felt intoxicated. Hans and the professor joined me later, and we together watched the beautiful scenery. "Greenland," my uncle said. I was surprised. "Yes, we are only 35 kilometers away from it. Here we are at the top of SNEFELL. Hans will tell us the name of that mountain," he said, showing a near mountain. "Skartaris," replied Hans. "Now, follow me to the crater," my uncle cried. As we got nearer, his impatience was getting unbearable. The crater of SNEFELL looked like an inverted cone. Its diameter should have been half a league. Its depth appeared to be approximately 2,000 feet. What madness! We are going into a mortar, I thought. Hans chose to penetrate by a spiral path so as to make the descent easier. In certain parts of the cone, Hans advanced with great precaution. At some riskful passages, we had to connect ourselves with each other using a long cord. We accomplished the journey to the ground of the crater at midday. I raised my head and gazed to the upper part of the cone. At the bottom of the crater there were 3 chimneys. SNEFELL sent fire and lava from its central furnace through these chimneys during eruptions. I didn't dare to look down either of them, but my uncle curiously examined all parts of the chimneys. Suddenly he uttered a cry. "Axel, Axel, come here!" he shouted. "Look!" On the western face of the block I saw the name of Arne Saknussemm inscribed in runic letters. "Arne Saknussemm!" replied the professor, now, Do you still doubt?" I didn't reply. The evidence was there, with all its aspects. In silence, I returned to my lava seat. The other Icelanders were sent when we reached the ground. At the beginning of the grand expedition, we were now 3 people. The fortnight in the crater passed away with an uneasy sleep for me. The next morning the weather was gray, heavy, and cloudy. We could see clouds on the summit of the mountain through the opening of the crater. It was evident that one of these chimneys would take us to the center of the earth. We were sure that Arni Saknussemm penetrated through one of these, but which one? Now my uncle was waiting in the shadow of Skartaris to touch that particular way in a few days. However, there was no sun, no shadow for now. It was the 25th of June. If the weather went on like this for the next 6 days, we would have to delay our visit. On the 26th, nothing happened. Rain mingled with snow. The next day was the same, but on the 29th of June, sun poured its light down the crater. Every hill, rock, and stone cast its shadow on the ground and on the walls of the place. Skartaris also laid down its sharp-pointed shadow on the middle chimney. "There it is," said my uncle with joy. "Now go to the center of the earth. Forward!" Thus began the real journey. We had to overcome all difficulties until now, but it seemed to me that the real difficulties would appear at any moment from now on. Now I had to look down the bottomless pit on which the Skartaris threw its shadow. I didn't dare to look until the supreme hour. I was scared, but in front of Hans I didn't want to seem like a coward. The idea of being less brave than Hans made me embarrassed. With these feelings I approached the central chimney. When I bent over the rock I gazed down and lost my feeling of equilibrium. I was just about to drop when a hand held me. Hans had saved my life. In order to make the descent easier, my uncle tied a cord down the chimney. Now we could safely descend holding the rope. "Let us examine our loads," said my uncle. "We will take only fragile ones with us. Hans will take the tools and some of the provisions. Axel, you will get another part of the provisions and arms. And finally, I will take the rest of the provisions and instruments." "What about the clothes, ladder, and ropes?" I asked stupidly. "They will go by themselves," replied the professor. Hans tied the non-fragile goods in a bundle and sent them down the chimney. Well, now it was our turn. We fastened the package of instruments and goods on our shoulders and commenced the descent. I was going behind Hans and my uncle. The cord which we were holding seemed too thin for 3 of us. Besides, the rock and lava block were getting loose from some parts. I don't suppose any geologist would have studied rocks under these circumstances. But my uncle was talking about chemical operations taking place on volcanic fragments and primitive rocks. I didn't see the bottom of the chimney for another 3 hours. We kept descending. I calculated the turns we made with the rope. We had repeated 14 times 200 feet. I knew that we started at 1, so it must have been 11 o'clock now. At this moment I heard Hans. "Halt!" "We are at the bottom of the perpendicular chimney," said my uncle. "There is a kind of passage to the right, but we will see it tomorrow. Now let's have supper and get some sleep." At 8 in the morning we woke up with a ray of daylight. It was light enough to distinguish the surrounding objects. "Well, Axel, have you ever spent a night as quiet as this? No noise of wheels and people?" "Undoubtedly it's quiet at the bottom of this well, but it's just that thing which makes me alarmed." "If you are already frightened, then what will you do as we proceed? We only reach the level of the island. This long vertical tube is only at the level of the sea." "Are you sure?" "Consult the barometer," said my uncle. "I am quite sure. Look! We have only atmospheric pressure now." "Will this pressure increase and become too painful to bear for us?" I asked. "No. We will descend at a slow rate so our lungs will become inured to the denser atmosphere. Now let us have some breakfast. We must be strong enough. As we don't know how long we will go, we had better take care of ourselves." After the breakfast, my uncle noted his scientific observations in his pocket notebook. "Now, Axel," he cried, "we are going really to the interior of the earth. The journey commences at this precise moment." He took Ruhmkorff's apparatus and stepped through the dark passage. Hans carried the other apparatus which would provide light for a long time, so we entered the gallery. I raised my head and looked at the sky for the last time. In the last eruption in 1229, the lava had formed a passage through the tunnel. The lava had formed a surface covered with small round blisters and crystal of opaque quartz. I admired the excellence of the mineralogical beauties in the walls of the passage. "Uncle, look! What a spectacular sight! It is magnificent! Don't you admire that lava passing from reddish to yellow in excellent shades?" "Ah, Axel, you will see greater splendors than these, I hope. Now don't lose time. March! March!" I frequently consulted the compass. Our direction was southeast, yet there was no increase in the temperature. 2 hours after our departure, the temperature increased only 4 degrees. This was the indication of the fact that our descent was horizontal, not vertical at all. About 8 in the morning we halted. I was hungry and exhausted. Hans prepared our provisions on a block of lava, and we ate hungrily. As for the supply of water, it was half consumed. My uncle was sure of finding a fresh supply of subterranean water, but until now we had not met one. I was getting angry and impatient. "Don't be uneasy, Axel. We shall find more water than we need," he said. "When?" I asked sharply. "When we leave this bed of lava behind us." "But maybe this passage runs to a great depth. It seems that we hadn't proceeded much vertically." "Why don't you think so?" "Because if we have gone into the deep crust of the earth, you would have met greater heat." "You think so? But what does the thermometer say?" 15 degrees nearly. It increased only 9 degrees since our departure. "According to my observations, we are at 10,000 feet below sea level." The professor's calculations were correct. The temperature should have been 81 degrees until now, but it was hardly 15 degrees. Chapter 7. Geological Studies. On the 30th of June at 6 a.m. in the morning, the descent began. We followed the gallery of lava until 12:17, when Hans stopped. "Ah, here we are!" exclaimed my uncle. "We are at the very end of the chimney." We were standing at the intersection of 2 roads. Both of them were dark and narrow. The problem was that of choosing the right one. My uncle looked rather calm. He showed no sign of hesitation and pointed out the eastern tunnel. We entered the dark passage at once. This gallery was more complicated. Its sections were unequal. A mile farther, we had to bow our heads under the corniced arches. In other places, we had to creep along very narrow passages. I was still thinking of SNEFELL to spread lava again, but it was not bold enough to share my ideas with the professor. He only thought of moving forward. In the evening, by 6 o'clock, my uncle announced the time for sleep. We rolled ourselves with rugs and spent the night without any fear for wild beasts or dangers from human beings. Here, under the great volcano of Iceland, we enjoyed absolute safety. The next morning, we awoke fresh. Again, we followed the path of lava, but this time it seemed to me that instead of tending lower, the passage grew more and more horizontal. I even felt a slight rise. Later, this tendency turned to be so evident that this time I didn't abstain from complaining. "I can't stand it any longer," I said. "What? It has only been 3 hours and the ground is easy," replied the professor. "It may be easy, but it's tiring at the same time." "We should continue going down." "But we are going up. For the last half an hour the slope turned upwards. Maybe we'll arrive at the level of Iceland," I protested. The professor seemed uneasy, so I didn't resume the conversation. We kept on walking. I paid greatest attention to keep up with Hans and my uncle. I didn't dare to lose sight of them for a second. The idea of being lost under the earth in this dark place scared me too much. What a terrible idea! On the other hand, as the road ascended steeper, I was delighted with the idea of coming nearer to the surface. Every step would bring me closer to my little Groben. By midday, the wall of the gallery began to change. The solid rock appeared rather different than the lava coating. "Look," I said, pointing to varied series of sandstones and limestone. "Well?" my uncle asked. "We are at the period when the first plants and animals appeared." "Do you think so?" I took the professor closer to the walls of the gallery with his lamp. I expected him to be astonished, but he didn't even say a word. Therefore, I wondered if he really understood me or not. It was evident that we had left the lava path, and this road would not possibly lead us to extinct furnace of SNEFELL. Was I mistaken? If I am right, I must soon find some fossil remains of primitive life as evidence, I thought. Fortunately, I didn't have to pace much, because these proofs presented themselves. I stepped onto something like a sea animal. I picked up a shell which contained its perfect form and turned to my uncle. "Look at this." "Well," he said quietly, "this is the shell of a crustacean, of an extinct species called tribolite, nothing more." "But does that not mean—" "It means different things to you and me, Axel," he ejaculated. "Yes, we have left the granite and lava. It is possible that I may be mistaken, but until I reach the very end of this gallery, I will not be sure." "Well, uncle, I approve of your determination, even though the danger which will threaten us so soon." "What danger?" "The want of water. Our water supply would only last for 3 days, and to our sorrow we had little chance to find a spring in these transition beds. The gallery opened up in front of us the next day. We walked on without speaking. Hans' silence seemed to infect us. The road was now ascending. In some places it even seemed to have a slight fall. However, this tendency was trifling and didn't seem to impress the professor. The walls were decorated with schist, limestone, and old redstone. On the shades of these elements, electric light was reflected with sparkling, magnificent light. We saw specimens of great marbles. Some of them were grayish agate, beautifully decorated with white. Some of them were red and yellow and fantastically in harmony with the dark cherry-colored marbles. On Friday, after a thirsty night, we continued into the passage of the gallery. After 10 hours walking, the reflection of our lamps seemed to deaden from side walls. The marble and limestone seemed to grow dark in color. When I touched it, my hand was black. "A coal mine!" I shouted. "A coal mine without miners," replied my uncle. "I am sure that this gallery was never touched by the hand of men. Anyway, time is money. Let's have supper." We ate in silence. I swallowed the few drops of water which was my share. After the meal, the professor and Hans went to sleep, but I couldn't sleep until morning. Next morning, on Saturday at 6 o'clock, we started again. In 20 minutes, we reached a vast open place. This cavern was about 100 feet wide and 50 feet high. The beds of coal were separated by strata of sandstone or clay. These wonders under the surface of the earth and this coal mine would never be discovered by any human being. I marched with these thoughts. The temperature didn't change much, only I smelt hydrogen. The gallery to the coal mine was so long that my uncle could hardly restrain his impatience. The way was horizontal. It was difficult to assess the length properly. In addition, the darkness prevented us from estimating the length of the gallery. I was of the opinion that the gallery was endless. At 6 o'clock we reached at the end of a blind alley. Right or left, top or bottom, there was no road further. "Very well, it's all right," said my uncle. "Now, at any rate, we will know where we are about. We are not at Snucknewsom's road, that's certain. Now we have to turn back. Let us have a night's rest, and in 3 days we will reach at the fork at the road behind us." "We will do it only if we have enough strength," I said. "Why not?" "Because tomorrow we will have no water." "But we still have courage, don't we?" I didn't dare answer. In the morning we started early. It was 3 days' march to the crossroads. During this backwards journey we endured many difficulties. By the end of the first day, the water completely finished. Now our only liquid for drinking was gin, but that burned my throat. The air and the temperature were stifling. My limbs were paralyzed with fatigue. For a few times I dropped down motionless. At these times my uncle and Hans toiled to make me feel better, but it was clear that my uncle was struggling against excessive fatigue and thirst too. At last, on Thursday, July 8th, we reached the junction of the two roads on our hands and knees. We were half dead. I was moaning. After some time my uncle took me in his arms. "Poor boy," he said in compassion. This softened mood of the professor was touching. I grasped his trembling hands and looked directly into his eyes. His eyes moistened. "Drink," my uncle said, holding the flask in his hand. He raised the flask and emptied all the water between my lips. What a pleasure it was. My burning mouth was moistened by a sip of water. It had been enough to bring me to life again. "This is the last. Do you hear, Axel? I kept this precious water at the bottom of my flask. How many times I fought against the impulse of drinking it. But no, Axel, I kept it for you." "My dear uncle," I said. Hot tears were falling down my cheeks. "Yes, my dear boy. I know that as soon as we arrived at this road, you would drop half dead, so I kept it to refresh you." "Thank you, my uncle, thank you," I said. Although that sip of water had only quenched partially, I felt stronger. As my mouth was moistened, I was able to speak now. "We must return," I cried vehemently. "We must go back to SNEFELL." "Return?" my uncle said. He was stunned. "Yes, return. We must return without any loss of time." "So, Axel, I see that you are just as feeble-minded as you were before. You only express despair and find something to complain about." "What? Will you not turn back?" "No, never." "Then we must wait for total destruction." "No, Axel, no. Go back. Hans will come with you. Leave me here. I have personally undertaken this expedition myself. I will carry it out to the end. I will not return. You can go, Axel." His voice was hard and threatening now. He was struggling against the impossibilities of our position. I would never leave him in this bottomless abyss. On the other hand, I was prompted with the feeling of self-preservation. Hans seemed to take part in the situation. He was indifferent to the situation, which would even end his own life. He was ready to do whatever his master told him. What kind of man was he? I was unable to understand him. How I wished to make him understand me. If Hans agreed with me, we, too, could maybe compel my uncle to come close to Hans. I placed my hands upon his. The Icelander only moved his head slowly and calmly pointed to my uncle. "Master?" "Master?" I shouted. "You madman! He's not the master of your precious life. We must go back. We must drag him. Do you understand?" I firmly seized his hands when my uncle interrupted. "Calm down, Axel. You cannot oblige Hans to do anything, so listen to me. Water is the only problem we face. In this eastern gallery, we haven't met any particle of moisture. Maybe we can find water in the western gallery." I shook my head dubiously. "Listen to me," he went on firmly. "When you were lying dead, I examined the formulation of that gallery. It penetrates directly downwards. In further places, we probably will reach granite rocks. There we can find abundant springs. Now listen to my proposal. I want only a day. If at the end of the day I haven't met the water, I will return to the surface of the earth. I swear." Although I was irritated, I was touched by this bold proposal. At the same time, my uncle was risking both his own and our lives. Chapter 8. Water, water. This time, the descent to the new gallery began. After only 100 yards, the professor moved the lantern along the walls. "These are primitive rocks. We are certainly in the right way. Forward!" As far as we proceeded, the succession of beds forming primitive rocks came out distinctively. We were in a marvelous place to study mineralogy and geology. Through the beds of schist colored with delicate shades of green, copper, and manganese, with traces of platinum and gold, the new gallery was like an open-air museum. I thought of the richness buried underneath the earth. The light of our lamps reflected beautiful sights of quartz, which sparkled at different angles. It was 8 in the morning. We hadn't yet met any sign of water. I was suffering. The professor kept going. He anxiously listened for the slightest murmur from distant springs, but I heard no sound. After a time it became more and more unbearable. I resisted pain, but I didn't dare stop my uncle. Finally I uttered a cry and fell on the ground. "Come, uncle, I am dying." "It is all over," he cried, coming near to me anxiously. It was the last thing I saw. When I reopened my eyes, my uncle and Hans were sleeping motionless. Were they really sleeping? I remembered my uncle's last words. "It is all over," he had said. But how could we reach the upper world again? The idea was crazy. A few hours passed. It was soundless as a grave. In my dizziness I thought that I heard a sound, but after a few minutes I saw the Icelander going away with a lamp in his hand. Was he leaving us? Why? My uncle was asleep. I wanted to shout and wake him, but my voice was gone. "Hans has left us," I cried. Maybe I thought that I shouted because I haven't heard my own voice. I was very weak. Yet after a moment I felt ashamed because of suspecting Hans. Was he not the most faithful man I had ever seen? He was now proceeding to the further part of the gallery, but he didn't go backwards. He wasn't leaving us. I was glad. Was he on a journey of discovery? I waited in silence. At last I heard footsteps in the darkness. Hans was coming. He came closer to my uncle and tried to awake my uncle. "Watten! Watten!" he said. I didn't know Danish, but I understood what it meant. "Water! Water!" I shouted, clapping my hands. It was clear that he was in search of water during his short journey in the gallery. Water was down below the floor. We quickly got prepared and walked in the passage. After an hour walking, I began to hear a sound. As we got near, it became more distinct. It was the sound of something running inside the granite wall. As the time passed, I began to feel disappointed. "Hans was not mistaken," said my uncle. "There is water running inside these walls." "Is it a torrent?" I asked. "Certainly. That is the sound of subterranean water flowing around us." We rapidly walked forward in great excitement. The murmuring of the water was already refreshing me. The sound was increasing as we came closer. The torrent flowed over our heads before, and now was running inside the wall. Every now and then I felt the wall, hoping to find some indications of moisture. Another half an hour passed. Still no water found. As we walked further, the noise got fainter. We returned. Hans stopped at the point where the torrent seemed closest. I sat near the wall. The water was flowing with extreme violence, but the granite wall of the passage between me and the water was very thick. Hans rose and took the lamp. He moved towards the wall. He put his eyes against the wall and cautiously listened. He was trying to examine the exact place. "We are saved!" I cried with joy. "Yes!" cried my uncle in frantic excitement. Hans calmly worked on the wall with skillful strokes. It was not an easy job. It took another 2 hours. Then, suddenly, we heard a sound of splashing water. The torrent streamed violently on the opposite wall. Our Icelander was nearly thrown off by the violence of the shock, but instead of joy, he uttered a cry of grief and disappointment. Before long, I quickly understood the reason. "The water is at the boiling point!" I shouted. "Well, never mind. Let it cool down for a while," replied the professor. While the tunnel was filling with water, we swallowed our first sip. I don't know anything more delicious than this water. Our burning thirst was passing away. Although it was warm, it brought life to 3 of us. I drank without stopping. I revived with energy. "Well, it is delicious." "Of course it is. It is found less than 6 miles of the ground. It is a grand source of freshness and strength. This source will be named after Hans. The name of this water is Hansbach." At this honorable idea of my uncle, Hans didn't seem proud. He calmly went to his corner after drinking enough water. "We must not lose this wonder," I said. "I don't think that this water will fail," replied my uncle. "But we cannot be sure. Let us fill our flasks and bottles. Then we must stop the opening." My advice was followed, but closing the hole was not easy. The pressure was too great. After much effort, my uncle suggested another idea. "Why do we have to trouble ourselves to stop the stream? When our flasks are empty, where will we fill them again? So let us allow the water to run on. It will flow down and will refresh us as well." "That is all right," I said, "if this water will be our guide. We can succeed in our expedition." "Ah, my boy, you agree with me now," cried the professor, laughing. Next day we felt much better, leaving all the suffering behind. We drank this excellent clay-beat water after breakfast. I felt wonderfully stronger. My determination was changed too. Now I was rather determined to go and accomplish this journey. Yet, with a firmly convinced scientist like my uncle, and a skillful guide like Hans, why should we not reach the final success? In these circumstances, if anyone asked me to turn back to the summit of the SNEFELL, I would have undoubtedly declined. We were lucky to descend all the time now instead of ascend. Besides, our fresh Hansbach was happily flowing near us. On Thursday at 8 a.m. we started. This time the granite tunnel took us to unexpected turns, which looked like a labyrinth. On the whole, we were moving in the southeastern direction. My uncle kept consulting his compass at every opportunity. Our refreshing stream ran gently at our feet, with its constant murmuring. Now that we had abundant, delicious water, and we had found the right way, I felt that I mustn't complain. The next day and the next, we made considerable way horizontally. Friday evening, on the 10th of July, we were approximately 30 leagues southeast of Reykjavik, according to our calculations. The dark abyss opened at our feet. My uncle clapped his hands when he saw the steepness of the descent. Without much difficulty, this will take us a long way, because the projections on the rocks are quite like a staircase, he said. So we followed the naturally formed winding staircase. Every quarter of an hour we halted to get some rest and to restore the action of our legs. Then we sat down on a rock and ate. After the meal we drank from our Hansbach, which of course lost its volume, but still it was very precious to us. On the 6th and 7th of July we kept going on spiral curves of this well. Finally, on the 8th, this abyss took a gentle slope to the southeast. Then the way turned to be easier to walk upon. On Wednesday, the 15th of July, we were 7 leagues underground, and had traveled 50 leagues away from SNEFELL. Although we were tired, we were perfectly healthy. We had long left Iceland behind us. If I am not mistaken, we have passed Cape Portland, and the long way we passed must bring us under the wide ocean, I said. Under the sea? My uncle rubbed his hands with delight. Is it possible? Is the ocean spread above our heads? Of course, Axel, this is so natural. My uncle found this very simple and natural, but as for me, I couldn't feel quite safe when I thought of the boundless ocean rolling over my head. 4 days later, Saturday, on the 18th of July, we arrived at a kind of vast grotto. Here, the professor paid Hans his weekly wages. We settled the next day as a day of rest. Chapter 9. Lost. As the next day was spared for rest, I woke up in good spirits. Although we were very deep under the surface of the earth, I got accustomed to the situation. I no longer thought of the sun, moon, stars, trees, houses, and cities. Since we were now at a distance from the source of the stream, it was no longer warm. We drank from it with joy. After breakfast, the professor arranged his notes. He was hoping to draw a map of our journey. First, I will make a calculation to know our exact position, he said. I observe the angles and the inclines everywhere. I am sure that there is no error in my calculations. Take your compass and let us see where we are now, Axel. Southeast by east, I measured. Well, said the professor, that means we have gone 85 leagues since we started. So, we are under the mid-Atlantic. Yes, surely. Perhaps there is a storm now above our heads, and the ships are rolling over us, and maybe the whales are moving the water with their giant tails, I said. It may be, Axel, but neither of them will shake us here. Turn back to our calculations. I reckon we are at a depth of 16 leagues. 16 leagues, I cried. This is the very limit of the thickness of the crust of the earth, and according to the law of increasing temperature, there should be a heat of 2,732 degrees Fahrenheit. Yes, my boy, answered my uncle calmly. And all this solid granite should be melted. You say that's not the case, my boy. What does the thermometer say? 27 degrees. "Therefore the savants were wrong, and the theory of proportional increase is a mistake," said the professor. After further calculations about the exact length we took, I found that we were now 16 leagues under the earth. We reached this point in 20 days, so we should need 2,000 days, or nearly 5 years, and a half in getting to the center. "Your calculations and hypothesis are all confused," shouted my uncle. "What is the scientific basis of them? How did you know this passage would not run straight to our destination? You have to hold your tongue, Axel. You are talking in a bothersome way." I didn't say a word against him. He was losing his temper again. "Look at the aneroid compass. What does it say?" "It says we are under considerable pressure," I replied. "Good. So you see that gradually going down, we get accustomed to the density of the atmosphere and don't suffer at all." "Except a little pain in the ears." "That is nothing. You can get rid of it by quick breathing," was his answer. The rest of the day passed in calculations and conversations. I envied the indifference of Hans, who did any kind of job without any hesitation. Very fortunately, we did not encounter many bad things, and the whole journey went well. I had small reasons to complain. When I thought about the glorious scientific discovery we would make, I was becoming just like my uncle. As a determined scientist, I felt quite like a Liedenbrock. I had scientific blood in my veins. For several days we passed steeper inclines and frightfully vertical abyss, which brought us nearer to the center of the earth. In these dangerous descents, Hans served excellently. His perfect calmness and coolness at riskful positions was precious to us. Thanks to him, we crossed many dangerous spots. By the 7th of August, we reached a depth of 30 leagues. We must have been 200 leagues away from Iceland. On that day, the tunnel went down with a gentle slope. I was walking ahead of them. I was examining the beds of granite. Suddenly, when I turned back, I saw that I was alone. I must have been going too fast, I thought. Hans and my uncle must have stopped on the way. I must join them. I walked for a quarter of an hour. I shouted. My voice was lost in the echoes. Frightfully, I gazed into the darkness. I began to get nervous. "I am sure I will find my companions again," I said. "I must calm down. There were not 2 roads. I will return and find them on the same road." I climbed up for an hour. I listened for any sound. I stopped. Nothing. There was a deadly silence in the dark gallery. I was lost. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that I was lost. There was only one road, so they were on this road. I must find them. They may have gone back thinking that I was behind them. No, I was ahead of them. I was sure. Then I got totally confused. All of a sudden, I thought of our invaluable guide, the stream. To my surprise, this beneficial stream was no longer at my feet. I stepped on rough, dry granite only. It would be impossible to describe my despair. I was buried alive. That was the one and only terrible fact. I would soon die of hunger and thirst. How did I leave the stream? How was I to return now? The granite floor was so hard that my feet didn't leave a mark on it. I was totally lost. Lost in the endless depths. I thought about things on the surface of the earth for a while. My poor Groben, our house in Hamburg. All of it passed through my mind. "Oh, my uncle!" I cried desperately. "What about him? He must have been going mad seeking me in this boundless passage. Until now he had cautiously walked with me without losing sight for a moment. He must have been desperate now. I had to arrive at the point where I left the stream. Then I might hope to find my way with the help of the stream. Therefore I must arrive at the point where I left it. Maybe I could reach the summit of SNEFELL if I found Hansbach. So I rose to my feet and began to ascend the gallery. I walked on without any hope, but I was determined. For half an hour I walked easily without any obstacle. I tried to recognize my way in the tunnel, but the rock formations and the projections of certain rocks seemed all the same. After a time I saw that this gallery would not take me back to the turning point. I was struck against an impenetrable wall. This was the abrupt end. I fell down upon the rock. I was seized by despair. I was totally stuck here, lost in a labyrinth. It was impossible to turn back. Here I would die in a dreadful way. My lamp began to grow faint. I couldn't set it right, and the light was paling. It would soon disappear altogether. I was afraid of closing my eyes for a single moment. To see the last glimpse of the light, I didn't dare to close my eyes. The next moment it totally failed. I lay desperately in the thick darkness, in which I was now totally blind. I began to lose control. I rose and stretched my arms in order to feel my way. I ran wildly in the maze. Without being able to stop myself, I was crying, shouting, and yelling. My face was covered with blood as my head struck the rocks. I lost consciousness. Chapter 10. The Sea of the Underworld. When I gained partial consciousness, my face was wet with tears. I don't know how long that state of mind lasted. I lost sense of time and space in this wide, dark place. I felt blood flowing over my body. I must have lost much blood after my fall. Rather than staying in this position, it would be such a pleasure to die. It would certainly be less painful. I was waiting for another faint as I grew weaker. Suddenly I heard a noise. I cautiously listened, hoping it to be repeated. Was that the sound of an explosion of gas? Was that the sound of a falling rock? 15 minutes passed. I didn't hear the noise again. Now it was so silent that I was able to hear my own heartbeats. Then my ear caught certain distant sounds, like words. I thought it was a delusion. But no. I listened more attentively. It was really a kind of murmuring voice. I was so weak that they didn't make any sense to me, yet I was sure that it was a language being articulated. Maybe those words were my own, brought by the echo. Maybe I was crying out unknown words to myself. I wasn't sure for a moment. To be sure, I firmly closed my lips and listened. I was able to hear distinctively. They were real words. "Help!" I cried with all my strength. "Help!" Some minutes passed. I heard no answer back. I thought that my weak voice didn't reach my uncle. But were they really my uncle and Hans? Of course, there could not be any other man under the surface of the earth. I pressed my ear against the wall and found the point where the voices were heard the best. This time I heard my name. It was my uncle's voice. He was talking to Hans. In order to make my voice hard, I must speak along this wall. This granite wall would conduct the sound of my voice. I had no time to lose. So, approaching the wall, I shouted, "Uncle Lidenbrock!" I waited for a reply anxiously. It would take some time for my voice to reach there. At last I heard these words. "Axel? Axel? Is that you?" "Yes, yes," I replied happily. "My boy, where are you?" "I am lost." "Where's your lamp?" "It is out." "What about the stream?" "It disappeared." "Axel, take courage, my boy." "Wait, I'm tired. I can't answer. Speak to me, uncle." "Don't speak," said my uncle. "Listen to me. We looked for you up and down in the gallery. I wept for you, poor boy. At last we fired our guns so that you could hear it. Don't be afraid, Axel. Now we are able to hear each other." "Oh, my uncle." "My boy," he tenderly answered. His voice reached me after a few seconds. "We must know how far apart we are." "That is easy." "Yes." "Have you got a chronometer?" "Yes." "Take it, say my name, and note the exact second when you speak. As soon as your voice reaches me, I will reply to you. Then you will write down the exact moment when you get my answer. Half of the time between my call and your answer will indicate the time that my voice took to reach you. Are you ready?" "Yes." "Now pay attention. I will call your name." I put my ear against the wall and immediately replied as soon as my uncle's voice reached me. 40 seconds, said my uncle. "So the road takes 20 seconds in coming. Now at the rate of 1,120 feet in a second, it makes nearly 4 minutes and a quarter." "You must go down, Axel," said my uncle. "We are in a vast chamber with endless galleries. Get up and begin walking. At the end you will find us. Drag yourself, Axel." "Goodbye, uncle," I shouted. "I am going. When I start walking, you will hear me no more." "Goodbye, Axel." These were the last words I heard. I thanked God from my heart. As my uncle's voice reached me, there could be no obstacles between us. Following the same direction, I could reach them. For this reason, I rose and dragged myself. The slope was rapid, and I slid down. The descent suddenly increased, and I was nearly falling. In a second, I quickly grasped a part of the rock and struggled on the edge. My head struck against a sharp corner of a rock, and I became unconscious. When I woke up, I saw that I was covered with thick coats and blankets lying in half darkness. My uncle was watching over me. Seeing that I was awake, he held my hands. "He lives! He lives!" he cried with frantic excitement. "Yes, I'm still alive," I said feebly. He pressed me to his chest. "My dear nephew." I was deeply touched by the tenderness of his manner. He was in greatest joy for finding me alive. "Where are we now, my uncle?" I asked faintly. "Tomorrow I will tell you everything, Axel. But first you must take a good rest. You are weak. I have bandaged your head. Sleep now." "But tell me, what day is it today, and what is the time?" "It is Sunday, the 8th of August, 10 o'clock at night. Don't ask any questions now. Go to sleep." That meant I had been lost for 4 long days. I was truly weak, my eyes involuntarily closed. I needed a good rest, so I went to sleep. The next morning, when I awoke, it was half light. There was light coming from a narrow opening in the grotto. It didn't come from a torch or lamp. Moreover, I heard an indistinct noise, like the murmuring of waves breaking on a shore. I even heard the whistling of the wind. Was it a dream? Was my brain affected by the fall? I was hearing imaginary voices. No, this was certainly a ray of daylight coming from the sun. It was sliding in through a cleft in the rock. That was really the sound of the waves and the blowing wind. "Good morning, Axel," said my uncle cheerily. "You look better." "Yes, I am." "You slept quietly. That must have done you good. Hans and I watched you in turn. Now you will have breakfast. The fever has left you. Hans rubbed your wounds with a special ointment. Icelanders keep that a secret. He healed your wounds perfectly. Hans is an excellent man." I eagerly devoured all the food that Hans prepared for me. Then my uncle told me how they found me in the dark gallery. When I was at the point of falling, a loose portion of rock had come down with me. Then they found me bleeding and insensible. There were bruises all over my body. "Thank God you weren't killed. I wish we would never separate again," he said. "Not separate? Does it mean that the journey is not over?" I asked in surprise. "What is the matter with you, Axel?" asked my uncle sharply. "Answer me, uncle. Am I really safe? Are my head and mind totally in good health?" "Certainly." "But I see daylight, and I hear the sound of the wind and the waves on the sea." "You will see it soon enough with your own eyes." "What? Take me there, uncle," I said. "No, Axel. Open air might be bad for you." "Open air? What are you saying?" "The wind is rather strong. You must be patient, my nephew. We have no time to lose, because the voyage can take a long time." "The voyage?" "Yes. Today or tomorrow we will set sail." "Set sail? What did all this mean? Was there a lake, river, or sea under the earth? Was there a ship? I was so curious that at last my uncle gave up restraining me. I wrapped myself with a blanket and came out of the grotto. As my eyes were not accustomed to light, I could hardly see anything at first. I opened them at last. I was stupefied. "The sea!" I cried in surprise. "Yes, this is Ledenbrock's Sea. It will be named after its discoverer." There was a vast mass of water stretching ahead of us. It spread far away, beyond eyesight. The shore was lined with a fine, shining sand. The waves broke on the shore with the murmur of the wind. Small seashells were scattered on the shore on the sparkling soft sand. It was quite an ocean with its irregular shores. About 100 fathoms from the limit of the waves, a huge wall of giant cliffs majestically rose. I was able to see this great sea from the beginning of the shore, and to the broad range it stretched. This was because of the favorable light, but the source of the light was not the sun at all. The illuminating power of this light, its trembling diffusiveness, and its clear, bright whiteness showed that the cavern was wide enough to contain an ocean. As for the sky, if it was right to call it so, it was composed of a cloud which contained variable vapors. Condensation of these clouds could cause rain at certain times. It was unexplainable that, under such a powerful pressure of atmosphere, there were broad tracts of vapor in the air. Yet the weather was fine now. We were in a great excavation place, which was an immense space, containing a vast ocean and cliffs with high peaks. Inside the deep abysses of the earth, the vastness of the place and the great ocean was astonishing. I don't know what geological theory would explain this. My uncle wasn't able to explain it either. I felt as if I were on a distant planet. I admired the scene with admiration. After living like prisoners without daylight for 47 days, I enjoyed the fresh air.
You feel strong enough to walk a little now?
Yes, nothing could be more delightful.
Come, Axel, take my arm and let's walk along the shore.
I eagerly accepted, and we began walking along the water. Down the huge rocks there were numberless waterfalls and hot springs. 500 paces ahead I saw an unexpected sight. Was that really a dense forest of trees of moderate height? They were formed like umbrellas with circle caps on top. I hastened to see them at once. Were they a kind of extinct species? Coming closer, my curiosity turned to admiration.
"It is only a forest of mushrooms," said my uncle.
There were thousands of them. Their huge cones didn't let light pass to their roots. Further on, groups of tall trees rose. These were colorless and easy to recognize. On the surface of the earth, there were only low shrubs, but here they attained gigantic sizes.
"Wonderful! Magnificent!" cried my uncle.
"Here is the entire floor of the second period of the world. These are vegetations of the transitional period. In the early ages, these humble garden plants were tall trees. Look, Axel, look!" "You are right, my uncle. They are excellent."
"It is a conservatory, Axel, but is it not also a menagerie?"
"Surely not."
"Look at the dust under your feet. There are bones scattered on the ground."
"Here they are!" I cried. "Bones of extinct animals!" I rushed upon these remains and named these monstrous bones without hesitation. "This is the lower jaw of a mastodon. These are the molar teeth of a Deinotherium," I said. "This femur must have belonged to the greatest of these beasts, the Megatherium. It is certainly a menagerie, because these bones show that they came here to feed on the vegetation. Here are entire skeletons. Still, I can't understand the appearance of these animals in a granite cavern."
"Why?"
"Because animal life only existed in the secondary period on Earth. At that time, the sediment of soil had been deposited by a river and was carried to this place."
"Well, Axel, this soil is alluvial."
"What? Alluvial soil under such a depth from the surface?"
"No doubt about it, Axel. At a certain period the earth consisted of an elastic crust or bark. Then, by the laws of attraction, a portion of sedimentary deposits was carried down through the openings."
"Perhaps," I said, "but may not some of these monsters still be living here? No creature has yet appeared, but why not?" I surveyed the open spaces around us. I felt anxious, and fear got a hold of me. Then I felt exhausted. I sat down at the end of the promontory. We were the only living creatures in this subterranean world. But where did the sea come to an end? Did we know anything about the opposite shore? Chapter 11. We set sail. The next morning I was quite well. Before breakfast I had a bath in the waters of the Liedenbrock Sea. After eating the delicious provisions Hans prepared for us, my uncle announced that he was waiting for the tide.
"We must not lose the opportunity to make use of the tide. Now it is a suitable time for the high tide."
"What tide?" I cried. "Can the power of attraction of the sun and the moon be felt down here?"
"Why not? Are not all the bodies subjected to power of universal attraction? Naturally, this mass of water will be exposed to it too."
"Here it is rising," I said, looking at the waves breaking on the shore.
"Yes, Axel. I expect it to rise about 12 feet.
"It seems very extraordinary, my uncle. I can't believe my eyes. Under the terrestrial crust, who could imagine the existence of an ocean with its storms and winds?"
"Evidently, there is no scientific reason against it,"
replied the professor calmly. "Can there be unknown species of fish in these waters?"
"We have not seen yet. We will soon unravel all the secrets of this newly discovered region."
According to our calculations, we were now under Scotland. Our compass still showed southeast. "What are you planning to do now, uncle? Will we return to the surface?"
"What? Return? No, Axel, everything has gone so well so far."
"But how will we cross the ocean?"
"Don't you hear the sound of the hammer? Hans is busy making a raft. We will set sail tomorrow. Our raft will be ready soon."
"What? Did he already cut the trees?" After an hour walking, I saw Hans busy at work. I was surprised to find the raft half finished. It was made of different kinds of wood and frames. "What wood is it, uncle?"
"It is made of pine, birch, and fir, which is mineralized by the actions of the sea."
Then, like the other fossil wood, it must be as hard as stone and can't float.
Some of them may be too hard, but some others, like ours, are of a different kind. Look!"
He threw a pair of branches into the sea. The bit of wood moved backwards and forwards with the waves. It didn't sink. The next day, thanks to the skillful hands of Hans, the raft was completed. It floated on the sea perfectly. It was now the 13th of August, the date of our sailing. We woke up early and prepared to start a less fatiguing voyage. Our provisions, instruments, arms, fresh water, and the baggage were safely placed on board. My uncle signaled to start. Our guide fitted up the rudder to steer his vessel. Then he took the tiller and unmoored it. We set sail. Soon we were floating. At the moment of leaving the harbor, my uncle wanted to give a name to the port. He was truly fond of naming his discoveries. "I have a proposal," I said. "Let it be called Port Gräuben."
"Very well. This port will be named after Gräuben."
The wind was blowing from northeast, and we were moving at a high speed. We would make 30 leagues in 24 hours. We hoped to see the opposite shore soon. Shadows of great clouds touched over the surface, and sparkling rays of electric light reflected drops of spray. Later on, we entirely lost sight of the land. Port Gräuben was out of sight now. At about 12 o'clock, big seaweeds came into sight. I wondered what natural force produced these plants. What was the appearance of the earth in its early stages? In the evening, the weather was the same, constant condition. After supper, I laid down on the raft and went to sleep. My uncle instructed me to keep a diary since our departure from Port Gräuben. So I registered every observation, including the direction, rate of sailing, the pressure, and other single peculiar notes during the voyage. Friday, August 14th. Wind from northeast, steady. We make a rapid way with the raft. Nothing in sight before us. Intensity of light is the same. Weather is fine. Thermometer, 89 degrees Fahrenheit. At noon, Hans prepared a hook and flung it into the sea after baiting it with small pieces of meat. Nothing was caught for 2 hours. Then there was a pull. He brought the struggling fish on board. "A sturgeon," I said. The professor was attentively examining the fish. The head was flat but rounded in front. It had no teeth, its pectoral fins were large, and it had no tail. My uncle believed that it belonged to an extinct family. "What? Have we taken an alive inhabitant of the seas of primitive ages?"
"Yes. You will see that these fossil fishes have no identity with any living species. This fish is blind. Actually, it has no eyes."
I examined it closely. That was true. This vast ocean was well inhabited with fish. For another couple of hours, we took a large quantity of fish from different extinct species. Despite being awake, I dreamed as if I were asleep. While sailing on the raft, I thought about enormous beasts. I could imagine tortoises, first ages of mammals, including gigantic tapirs, camels, horses, and hippopotamus. Higher up, the first monkey on earth was now climbing the steep ascent. Even higher up, huge birds larger than ostriches opened their vast wings and flew above me. Over the strand I saw a strange creature which looked like a horse, camel, and hippopotamus all at the same time. A mastodon twisted its trunk and walked over the shore. In my vivid imagination, all members of the extinct world were rising to life. Ages passed like days, and I observed terrestrial changes. Plants disappeared, granite rocks softened, and intense heat converted solid bodies into thick fluids. Waters covered the surface of the earth. I was now floating on the water. My body was not firm anymore. I was volatilized. "Is this a dream? Where am I?" "What is the matter?" my uncle asked. I fixed my eyes upon him. "Take care, Axel, or you will fall off board." At that moment Hans seized me vigorously. "What is this all about?" I cried faintly at last. I woke up. "Do you feel ill, my boy?" asked my uncle anxiously. No, but I had strange hallucinations. It's all over now." Saturday, August 15th. No land in sight. The horizon seems distant. My uncle lost his temper. He examined the horizon with his glass, but the voyage is going well. The raft is spinning along with marvelous speed. "You seem anxious, my uncle," I said. We are going very fast. What makes you impatient?"
"Yes, the rate is high, but the sea is too wide."
Then I remembered that my uncle had estimated the sea to be 30 leagues. We had made that distance, yet the opposite shore did not show up.
"We're losing time. We are not descending as we should."
Had Saknussemm really followed this path? Did he really meet this water, and did he cross it? My uncle asked suspiciously. Sunday, August 16th. Weather has not changed. The wind freshens. I observe the intensity of the electric light. The sea must be as wide as the Mediterranean or the Atlantic. My uncle tied the heaviest of the pickaxes to a long rope and let it down into the water. No bottom yet. It was too deep. When the pickaxe was taken back, Hans pointed out deep prints on its surface. They looked like teeth marks. These prints were the marks of really sharp teeth. Was there a monster beneath us, more ferocious than a shark? Did this mean that my dreams had come true? All day I was disturbed by the idea. Monday, August 17th. I tremble with fear when I remember the monsters in my dream. I fearfully watch the sea. I am sure that my uncle is also anxious about the same thing. He keeps watching the water. I examined our guns, and my uncle looked at me approvingly. We have to be ready for any kind of danger. Tuesday, August 18th. In the evening we are worn out. I slept while Hans was at the helm. After 2 hours a terrible shock awoke me. Our raft heaved upon a strong wave.
"Have we struck land?"
asked my uncle. Hans pointed out a giant moving animal away from us. "It is an enormous porpoise!" I cried with fear.
"Yes, and there is a sea lizard. I can see a crocodile too. It's diving down. There is a whale. Look at its great fins!" shouted my uncle.
We were amazed upon seeing the monsters. They were unbelievably big in size. Hans wanted to get away from them, but on our other side was a huge tortoise, and a serpent lifted its fearful head. The reptiles rose and turned around the raft in great rapidity. I took up my rifle. We were dumb with fear as the creatures came closer. The crocodile on one side, the serpent on the other. We were stuck. Then the monsters passed the raft, and a battle started in the sea. We could clearly see the deadly conflict between the two monsters. But later, it seemed to me that the porpoise, whale, lizard, and the tortoise joined in the fight too. According to Hans, there were only 2 animals in the fight. My uncle agreed.
"The first of the monsters has a porpoise's snout, a lizard's head, and crocodile's teeth. We were mistaken. It is the most terrible of the ancient monsters. The other monster is a serpent, which looks very much like a lizard. It has the paddles of a turtle." Those giant animals attacked each other with great antagonism. 2 hours passed. The struggle continued. We remained motionless on the raft, ready to fire. Suddenly, they disappeared. The serpent was fatally wounded. Chapter 12. An Electric Storm. Wednesday, August 19th. The wind blows violently. My uncle looks impatient again. Thursday, August 20th. Wind is unsteady. Temperature is high. About noon, a distant noise is heard. It is like a continuous roar. Hans climbs up the mast, but he can't see. The sea is smooth. 3 hours pass. The roaring seems to increase from a distant waterfall. Will we fall down to an abyss? This would certainly make my uncle happy, as it would take us to a deeper place in a short time. I can't make out if the roaring comes from the water or the air. The sky is calm. The clouds still reflect beams of electric light. There is no change on the horizon, nothing extraordinary. The deafening noise is produced by a mass of falling water. Hans rose and climbed up the mast again. This time he saw something and told my uncle in Danish. The professor took his glass and attentively gazed for a minute. "Yes, I see a vast inverted cone, perhaps another sea beast."
The nearer we approach, the higher the jet of water. What monster could possibly fill itself with such a large quantity of water? Is it an illusion? It lies motionless. I am seized by terror. I refuse to go further.
"An island!" cried my uncle. "That column of water is a geyser, like those in Iceland."
As we approached the liquid column, it looked magnificent. This islet resembled an enormous sea beast indeed. From time to time, deep and heavy explosions are heard. "Let us land," said the professor. I leap on the rock with my uncle. The soil shivered under our feet. We walked on granite mingled with silicous tufa. For some minutes I watched the geyser spreading water with a variable force. At last we left the island, which my uncle named after his nephew. Friday, August 21st. The wind has risen and carried us away from Axel Island. The weather will change. The atmosphere is charged with vapors. Evaporation of saline waters generates electricity. The air is heavy. The sea is calm. Then, I feel as if my body is under the action of some electrical machine. At 10 in the morning, the symptoms of a storm become clearer. "There is some bad weather coming on," I said, watching the sky. The professor didn't answer. He watched the mass of water with anxiety. A heavy storm was coming on. A deep silence fell upon us. The roaring of the wind now hushed into a calmness. With the first shock, the wind could capsize us at any moment. "Let us cut the mast down," I said. "No, no, never!" cried the professor. "Let the wind catch us. I want to see the shore as soon as possible." All of a sudden, an indefinable thing happened. A sudden change took place in the southern sky. The air carried itself with a whirlwind. It violently rushed on through the cavern. It got darker. The helm made rapid maneuvers. My uncle fell to the floor of the raft. I quickly crept close to him. He watched this natural phenomenon with awful looks. The raft flew at a very high speed. The foaming clouds of spray dashed us from side to side. The sea boiled and electric fire descended with violent movements. Flashes of lightning were followed by continuous thunder. Under the dazzling light my eyes failed to see properly. My ears were stunned with ceaseless clashes of thunder. We were in a desperate condition. Sunday, August 23rd. We are driven forward swiftly. It is impossible to measure the speed. Where are we now? The night was fearful. The storm continued violently. The roaring of the wind didn't stop for a moment. The lightning flashed incessantly. We were still being driven on the raft, but to where? The heat began to increase. Monday, August 24th. Would this ever come to an end? We are totally worn out. The waves rose above our heads. The sea is still rough. Since we left Axel Island, we took a great road. We had to secure ourselves and our goods as fast as possible. For 3 days, we had not been able to hear each other. The sound of the storm and the thunder was deafening. All of a sudden, a ball of fire bounded over the waves and lit the raft. The mast and the sail flew up in a moment, and we were thrown up into the air. We were in a terrible shock. As the fireball moved slowly around the raft, our blood ran cold. It revolved around its axis with astonishing velocity. It was half white, half azure in color. Here it came, glided and moved around the ragged stump of the mast. Horrible! We will be blown up. It approached. It is near Hans, threatening my uncle's head. My uncle fell upon his knees and tried to avoid it. Now it turned towards me. I became pale, trembling under the melting heat. It dropped onto my feet, and I moved round upon the deck silently. The air was filled with a suffocating smell of nitrogen. It filled our lungs. We suffered stifling pains. I couldn't move my feet. The electric fire must have magnetized every iron particle on board. The nails of my boot clung to a plate of iron. On the raft, the intense and dazzling light disappeared. Hans was still at the helm. My uncle was fully stretched out, lying on the raft. Tuesday, August 25th. I recovered from a long swoon. The storm continued to roar. The lightning dashed continuously. We proceed at an incalculable speed. Perhaps we are under England or France. The next day the weather was splendid. When my uncle woke me up, we were at last on the shore. After our raft was thrown upon the rocks, I was hurled to the waves. If I am still alive today, that is because the powerful arms of our guide came to rescue me. The brave Icelander then carried me to the sand near my uncle. He then returned to the rocks and saved our goods as quickly as he could. Now I was awake and ready for a strong breakfast. "Have you slept well?" my uncle asked. "Oh, very well. I'm only a little knocked up," I said. "But I will soon be better. You seem delighted today, my uncle." "Indeed, my dear boy, I am happy. We have arrived at last.
We have reached the shore. The endless sea is behind us. Now we will go by land. The journey to the depths will begin. Hans will have to repair the raft. He is a clever boy. Let us examine our cargo." On arriving at the shore, I found Hans surrounded by our goods. Everything looked in good order. This man had been at work all the time while we were asleep. As for the goods, the aneroid, the compass, and the instruments were in good condition. The ladders, ropes, picks, and spades were all right too. Only our firearms were lost. "As we have no guns, we cannot hunt, that's all," my uncle said. "What about our provisions?" I asked, looking in at the food boxes. They were in a perfect state of preservation. We had 4 months' supply of biscuits, salted meat, salted fish, and spirits. "No, we will replenish our supply of water with the rainwater. Therefore, we will no longer have a water problem. Now, let's have breakfast." "Where are we now, Uncle?" I asked during the meal. "It is difficult to calculate exactly," answered my uncle. "Perhaps it is impossible. During 3 days I have been unable to keep my account of rate or direction. Still, we must have an approximation. After adding the 4 days' storm at a very high speed, we must have now reached the Mediterranean. But our exact position depends on the direction. Maybe we have deviated during the storm." "Let's consult the compass." He took the compass. He looked again and again with a strange expression on his face. "What is the matter?" I asked. The north pole of the needle had turned south. It now pointed to the shore instead of to the open sea. I shook the box, examined it. It was in good condition. Therefore, that meant there had been a sudden change in the wind, which had brought us back to the shore. Did we take all that way only to turn back to our starting point? Chapter 13. A Great Discovery. My uncle looked stupefied at the idea of going backwards all along that dangerous voyage. All the fatigue and dangers we met were in vain, all for nothing? But the professor rapidly recovered from the shock. "Aha! Will the fate play tricks on me? I will show what a determined man can do." "Just listen to me," I said firmly. "Ambition must have a limit. We are not in a suitable condition for a second sea voyage. Don't you see that we are all tired and our raft is damaged? We cannot steer. Are we mad enough to set sail on a damaged raft?" Despite all my logical reasons against the idea of setting sail, the professor announced that we would not set sail until tomorrow. He even instructed Hans to put everything on board and arrange every necessary preparation for the departure. He was determined to show the power of the human being against nature. Anyway, he was disappointed for having gone backwards all the way. In fact, we were not upon the north side of the sea. We did not know this at that moment, of course. At the end of a very long sea voyage, we were not at our starting point. But then, we left Hans at work and started examining the place. There was a considerable space between the sea and the foot of the cliffs. It took half an hour for us to reach the rocks. Under our feet, numberless shells in different sizes and forms. We kept walking. We were walking upon sedimentary soil. My uncle carefully examined every single particle. After walking for nearly a mile, the quality of the soil suddenly changed. It was now contorted and convulsed by a violent upheaval of lower strata. We walked on granite and crystals of quartz and alluvial deposits. It was a vast plain which contained bleached bones on it. Here on this part of the shore there was enough material to complete the history of animal life. We stepped on the remains of prehistoric animals and other interesting fossils. I was amazed, so was my uncle. He attentively gazed at the immense collection of scattered bones. There were more of them in the area. With a rush, my uncle laid his hand on a bare skull and gave a cry. "Axel! Axel! A human head!" "A human skull?" "Yes, look at it. We have made a great discovery." I was well able to perceive the frenzied excitement of my uncle, who himself found the remains of the primitive man. It was a perfectly recognizable human body. The corpse was dried. Its skin was like parchment, tightly covering the body frame. Its hand and toenails were very long. It had abundant hair and teeth. I was mute. Likewise,
My impatient uncle was struck with shock. He was dumb, too. We attentively raised the body and stood it against a rock. It seemed as if he watched us from the dark eye orbits of his primitive age. After some minutes, my uncle was himself again. He stood in front of the body. According to him, the entire body was preserved for purely anthropological purposes. How he wished that famous anthropologists and scientists were with him at that moment. "I wish I had this solution of sulfuric acid to wash it," continued the professor. "I'd be able to clear it from all earthly particles. But we still have a chance to examine it." He held the fossil skeleton. "You see, it is not 6 feet long. It is evidently of a Caucasian family. It is from white face. The skull is a regular oval. Its cheekbones and jaws are not prominent. As for the facial angle, I can go further in my deductions. I will affirm that this man is of a race which spread from the Atlantic. If you ask me how he came here, I cannot answer." Later on, we discovered that the fossil man was not the only one in this immense catacomb. At every step we met other human bodies. This cemetery scene forced me to think. Until now we had only seen sea monsters alive and the fishes. Might some living man be here, around us? Chapter 14. Vertical Ascent. We trod upon the bones for another half an hour. Our curiosity forced us to go further. What new scientific treasures lay there? I was prepared for any surprise. My curious uncle pushed me forward. We silently advanced. By an unknown natural law, the light was luminous. It lighted equally from all sides and created no shadows. After walking a mile, we reached a vast forest. Here, unlike the fungi forest in Port Gros, we saw yews, cypress trees, and long climbing plants. A few sparkling streams ran in silence under the trees. As a remarkable feature, these plants were gray in color, as they grew without the effect of heat and light of the sun. There were many flowers which looked like brown paper flowers, without color or scent. I followed my uncle with fear and amazement. We marched through the forest. Suddenly I halted and drew my uncle back. I, with my own eyes, saw an immense moving figure among the trees. There were gigantic mammals. They were not fossil remains this time. These animals were alive. I saw huge elephants twisting their trunks. My dream had come true. In the bowels of the earth, we were alone, left to the mercy of the wild animals. "Come, come," said my uncle. "Forward!" I refused to continue as we didn't have guns, but he ignored me. Suddenly I saw another moving object. At first I thought that it was a hallucination. In fact, a quarter-mile ahead of me, a human being was standing. He was watching the countless herds of animals. It was a giant who was able to control these monsters. It was at least 12 feet in height. His huge head was unshapely and looked like a buffalo head. Its face was half hidden in thick and tangled hair. We stood there with mouths open. He could see us. We must fly. We quickly got away from this horrible monster. Now that I was far from them, I was calm, and I could think properly. Did our senses deceive us? Did we see something very different? No. But it was unbelievable, even absurd. Maybe it was an animal resembling a human figure. Maybe it was an ape or a baboon of early ages. Then we left the horrible forest behind and began to run. One of those horrible creatures could follow us. When we reached Ledenbrock Sea, I gazed to the surrounding rocks and places to make sure that we had never been here before. As the needle of the compass showed the reverse direction, we thought that we were at our starting point. But neither I nor my uncle was able to explain this. Furthermore, the place didn't look like our departure place at all. I expressed my doubts to my uncle. He hesitated at first. "Can you be mistaken, Axel?" "It is hard to speak without hesitation, uncle. Maybe if we examine the scene, we can find our own traces." "I don't think so, Axel, because I don't see any trace." Just at that moment, I saw a metal object lying on the ground. It was a rusty dagger. "Look!" I said. "Did you have this weapon with you? Is it yours?" asked my uncle. "No, it's not mine. May this be yours?"
No, I have never had this object before.
It is strange. This may have belonged to Hans. Icelanders often carry arms like this. He must have lost it.
I have not seen it with Hans, said my uncle, shaking his head.
Maybe it belonged to a past warrior who came here before us. At this idea, my uncle abruptly stopped me.
Calm down, Axel. This dagger belongs to the 16th century. It is the kind which gentlemen carry with them. It doesn't belong to Hans. It must have belonged to a great man. Axel, we are about to make a great discovery. This blade has been left here for more than 300 years.
Who was that man?
The owner of this blade must have used it to engrave his name somewhere in the rocks. Let us look around.
There, upon a granite rock, we saw the runic letters, showing the initials A.S.
Arne Saknussemm, you marvelous genius! Cried my uncle. You have not forgotten one indication to show the way through the terrestrial crust, and your followers can now again trace your footsteps after 300 years. Your great name leads the bold traveler to the center of the planet. I will inscribe my name on this granite, but this cape will be named after you, as the first discoverer, Cape Saknussemm. I was amazed at the sight of these letters, so my uncle's excitement was expected. These letters were the true indications of existence of that wonderful traveler. I forgot everything. After the dangers of our journey until now, the coming dangers and excitements didn't seem impossible to me.
"Forward! Forward!" I shouted. I was ready to examine the gloomy tunnel in which Arne Saknussemm walked past. My uncle stopped me. "Let us find Hans first," he said. "We will bring the raft here. Now we will go down. Do you know that we are only 1,500 leagues away from the center of the earth?" "Is that all?" I cried with surprise. "That is nothing. Let us start! March! March!" Everything was ready for departure when we arrived. Hans had landed every necessary article on board. We took our places, and Hans steered us along the coast to Cape Saknussemm. After 3 hours' sailing, we reached a place suitable for landing. I didn't want to lose a single minute. Then my uncle took me to examine the new gallery. We examined the surroundings carefully. Suddenly, our process was interrupted by an immense block of rock. Right and left, we searched for a passage in vain. I was disappointed. This huge rock was certainly impassable. "But how did Saknussemm pass it?" I said faintly. "I don't know," replied my uncle. "This giant rock must have been shaken down by some shock or convulsion. Many years have passed since Saknussemm came here. It is probable that he didn't encounter this obstacle. If we don't destroy it, we will lose the chance of reaching the center of the earth." "Well," said my uncle, "let us make away with our tools." "No, it is too hard for our spades and pickaxes. Moreover, it would take us too long. We must use gunpowder." "Hans, to work!" my uncle ordered firmly. He found my advice logical. Hans quickly returned to the raft and brought necessary equipment. We had to make a hole large enough to contain a large amount of gunpowder. While Hans was at work, I was terribly excited, so I helped him to make the things go quicker. By midnight, our preparations were over. "Tomorrow," said my uncle, "we will do it." The next day, Thursday, August the 27th, at 6 o'clock in the morning, we woke up. I voluntarily undertook the honor of lighting the fuse. I prepared to fulfill my task with great excitement. It would take 10 minutes before setting the fire to the gunpowder. Therefore, I had enough time to get away to the raft. "Now go," said my uncle. "Immediately turn back to us." I opened my lantern and walked to the mouth of the tunnel. My uncle was waiting for me with the chronometer in his hand. "Ready?" he shouted. "Yes." "Fire!" I swiftly fired the fuse and ran at the top of my speed. "Come on board quickly, let us push off," my uncle shouted with frenzy. With a vigorous strength, Hans sent me up from the shore. It was now a time of great excitement. 5 minutes more, counted my uncle. 4, 3, 2, 1. Now! All of a sudden the rocks fell like a curtain, and a bottomless pit opened up on the shore. The sea lashed onto the passage with great speed and lifted our raft violently. We all fell down in the raft. In a very short time we were in great darkness. I thought that we were sinking. I wanted to call to my uncle, but it was impossible. Darkness, noise, astonishment, and terror. A great gulf opened in the shore. Now the sea was filling the gallery and carrying us along to it. Perhaps an hour or two passed. We held each other to save ourselves being thrown off the raft. We were carrying the whole sea along with us. The raft moved with such great rapidity that it was impossible to measure it. Our electric apparatus was shattered by the force of the explosion, and we weren't able to light the torch yet. Then our skillful Hans was able to light a lantern. I could now see that we were in a wide gallery. The falls of water which carried us down were in great rapidity. The raft was moving at a high speed, out of our control. We firmly held the mast for not being thrown off. Hours passed. I examined the cargo and found that the greater part of it was lost. To exactly know what is saved, I searched every tiny article with care. To my astonishment, none of our instruments were saved. We had only a chronometer and a compass. We had no spade, pickaxe, hammer. They were all lost. There was only a bit of cord. What about the provisions? To make things worse, we had only one bit of salted meat and a few biscuits. We had only 1 day's provisions left. I stupidly stared at our provisions. Anyway, why was I troubling myself with the provisions? Under these circumstances, now being carried by violent waters to some unknown place, it didn't matter. If we had had 4 months' supply of food, what would it matter? For a moment I forgot my present situation. We had no chance of escaping from this threatening torrent. That meant we would never have the chance to turn back to the surface of the earth. I explained this dreadful situation to my uncle. Maybe we could calculate how much time we had until death. But I didn't dare. Keeping silent would serve us good, maybe. Besides, I wished to leave my uncle cool enough to make reasonable decisions. At that moment the light of the lantern got pale and went out entirely in a short time. There was no hope left now. How could anyone expect things to get better in such a position? Deep darkness surrounded us. Although we had a torch, we knew that it must be kept. Then I firmly closed my eyes like a child. Our speed doubled after a time. It was impossible to measure it. We were no longer sliding, but evidently falling down. We were dropping vertically. My uncle and Hans firmly held me when the raft was beaten by immense waves. I was suffocating. I was drowning. In a few minutes, I was on the surface again. My uncle and Hans were still holding me fast by the arms. I was still alive. "We are going up," said my uncle after some time. "What do you mean?" "Yes, we are going up." I stretched my arm and touched the wall. We were ascending with extreme rapidity. "The torch," shouted my uncle. Hans quickly lit the torch, and we were able to see where we were. "We are in a narrow tunnel. As the water fills its bottom, we are now rising to its level." "Where are we going?" "I don't know, but we must be ready for anything. At this rate we shall get on. Our rate is too high." "What if the ascent stops?" I asked. "If the air is condensed by the pressure of this water, we will be crushed." "Axel," said the professor calmly, "we are in a desperate position, but we still have a chance. Even in this condition, let us enjoy the slightest chance of being saved. Now, let us eat something." It was time to inform my uncle about the provisions. "What? Have we lost our provisions?" "Yes. All we have is here, my uncle. Do you still think that we have a chance?" He did not answer this time. After an hour, we were moving at a high speed. The heat was gradually increasing. After all, we had to deal with the heat as well. After the first shock, my uncle told me that we had to be strong, and then consider our chance of escape. For that reason, he recommended that we consume all of our food, which was indeed scarce. So, we ate our last meal in silence. "As long as the heart beats, as long as the body and the soul keep together, I cannot admit that any willing creature will lose chance of living," my uncle shouted. He was determined to get past this. It was 5 o'clock in the morning when our last meal was over. We all returned to our own thoughts and sat quietly. I was remembering the surface of the earth. What was happening in our house in Koningsstrasse? What were my beautiful Grauben and our kind Martha doing? While I was occupied by dreams, my uncle still tried to get a clue of our position. He observed the structure of rocks. He was murmuring geological terms. Eruptive granite, he was saying. We are still in the primitive period. But why are we going up still? This is gneiss, here is mica schist. Presently we came to the transitional period. The temperature kept rising. I felt trapped in a boiling place. Are we rising to a furnace? I asked impatiently. No, that is impossible, said my uncle. Really? This wall is burning hot, don't you feel it? The water is getting hot too. A terror seized upon me. I knew that a catastrophe was approaching. I could no longer bear the situation. Even if we were alive at the end of this ascent, we could not live long due to food shortage. The heat was unbearable. Where were we? Where were we going? Chapter 15. Home at last. Now we were totally lost. The compass was no longer our guide. I heard incessant and continuous explosions, which resembled the loud clatter of trains. The mineral crust of the globe threatened to burst. The fissure in which we were driven came together with a crush. The gallery would be filled now. We were going to be buried alive. We are lost, uncle, lost. What is the matter, Axel? He calmly replied. The matter? Look at those quaking walls. Look at those shivering rocks. Don't you feel the burning heat? The dense vapor fills the air. It gets thicker every minute. Don't you see? Our compass needle is out of order due to this change. An earthquake is threatening us.
You are evidently mistaken.
What? You don't recognize the symptoms?
Symptoms of an earthquake? No, Axel. I expect something better.
What do you mean? Explain.
Axel, this is an eruption.
An eruption? What? Are we running up the shaft of a volcano?
I think we are,
said the professor with an air of self-possession. It is the best thing that could possibly happen to us. The best thing? Was my uncle mad? What? Are we being taken up in an eruption? And you call this the best thing now? We will die among burning lava, molten rock, and boiling water. We're going to be expelled in the air along with volcanic matter. The smoke and the flames will cover us. Do you still think that this is the best thing? Yes, he answered calmly. This is the only way for reaching the surface of the earth. Thousands of ideas passed through my mind. I was no longer doubtful about the insanity of my uncle. He had never seemed to me more daring. In the meantime, we kept going upwards. The night passed. The sound of the moving rocks and roaring intensified. My last hour was approaching. Beneath our raft, the water was boiling, and we were being carried by the wave of the eruption. As this mountain could not possibly be SNEFELL, where were we? Were we in the chimney of an active volcano? Which one was that? Towards the morning our speed accelerated. An enormous force generated by the extreme pressure of confined vapors was driving us irresistibly forward. As the heat increased, we approached nearer to the surface of the globe. The liquid column had disappeared. We were no longer carried on water. Instead, we were on lava paste and boiling eruptive matter. The temperature was unbearable. About 8 in the morning, a new incident occurred. The upward motion stopped. The raft lay motionless. What is that? I asked with fear. It is a halt. Did the eruption stop? I hope not. Trying to look around me, I rose. The blast of ashes and rubbish didn't move any more.
You are afraid. Don't be alarmed, Axel. This will not last long. In a short time we will resume the journey to the mouth.
Then suddenly the raft hurried and was driven forward with a rapid force. This time the ascent lasted for 10 minutes. After that, we started again with renewed and increased speed. I cannot tell for sure how often this operation was repeated. At each fresh pulse, we were driven with increased speed. During the short halts, we were stifled with heat as we were rapidly going up. My breath almost stopped. My brain was overheated. I felt dizzy. Little by little, I lost consciousness. By constantly repeated shocks, my brain weakened. One more time, Hans saved me from falling off board. Therefore, I don't exactly remember what happened while we were being driven out of the chimney. I only remember continuous explosions, the shakings of the rocks, and the whirling movement of our raft. When I opened my eyes again, I found that I was being grasped by my belt by Hans. He supported my uncle with his other hand. Although we were shaken and our bodies were bruised, I was not seriously injured. I was lying on the sloping side of a mountain. While I was rolling on the edge of a crater, Hans had saved me. "Where are we?" asked my uncle fretfully. "Is it Iceland?" I asked.
"What? Not Iceland!"
shouted my uncle. After all astonishing events, this was our final surprise. The professor and I expected to see barren deserts of Iceland rather than this sunny place. On the contrary to our expectations, we were sitting on a mountain which looked over a green country. It was very hot. The burning rays of the southern sun were blinding us with their vertical rays. We were all half naked. The warm air and the feeling of heat amazed me. Where were we if we were not in Iceland?
"Well, this is not Iceland," my uncle said. "This is not a northern mountain. Look, Axel, the caps of the mountains are not covered with snow."
The volcano soared above our heads. It still burst stone, ashes and lofty columns of fire at intervals. Streams of lava ran, but the base of the mountain was perfectly hidden. This volcano stood on a beautiful island, which rested on a blue and wide sea. Beyond, we could see a little village with a few small houses. "Where are we?" I asked faintly. My uncle looked around with surprise. He had no idea.
"Well, whatever mountain this may be, we will find it out later. It is very hot here. The explosions continue, but I don't think they will come out with the eruption, so we will be safe here. Now we had better get down. I am starving. We have to learn where we are."
The slope of the volcano was in great steepness in many places. Carefully avoiding the lava streams, we slid down slowly. "We are in Asia," I said. "We have passed half of the globe and come out nearly at the antipodes. We must be on the coast of India or in Oceania."
"But the compass?"
said my uncle. "Yes, the compass shows northward, so we moved northwards."
"Has the compass lied?"
"No, certainly. Could it lie?"
"No,
but it is not the pole. But I am not sure, indeed." Here we were completely confused. All of our estimations were inaccurate. Under the surface of the earth, we could make assumptions of our place. But here, with all these concrete clues, we were still unable to figure it out. As we descended, the greenery got denser. I was suffering from a violent thirst and hunger. Fortunately, after 2 hours walking, a beautiful country lay before us. Everywhere was covered with olive and pomegranate trees and delicious wines. We felt the nourishing coolness of the sweetest fruits. It was such a great pleasure. We ate mouthfuls of grapes and other fresh fruits. A few paces ahead of us I saw a spring of fresh water. We rushed and washed our hands and feet with great joy. While we were busy with this marvelous coolness, a child appeared. "Ah!" I cried, "an inhabitant of this land!" It was a poor boy, maybe a sufferer from poverty. As we were in desperate situation with our ragged hair and beards, it was not surprising that he was alarmed. Just at this time, the little one tried to run away. Hans caught him. Now my uncle was ready to question the child. He first tried to encourage him. He first asked the name of the mountain in German. The child did not answer. "Well, we are not in Germany," he said. I asked the same question in English. He didn't reply. My uncle was losing his temper, of course. "Is the child dumb?" he asked furiously. He tried his chance again in French. Still no answer. "Now let us try Italian," my uncle went on. "Will you speak now?" My uncle shook the child by the ears. "What is the name of this mountain?" he asked in Italian. "Stromboli," answered the little boy, slipping out of Hans' hands. "Stromboli? We are in the middle of the Mediterranean. We are on the island of the ancient city. Those distant blue mountains were Calabria Mountains, and the threatening volcano was certainly the fierce Etna." "Stromboli," I repeated. What a journey we had accomplished! It was marvelous. We entered from a volcano in Iceland, and from that barren land we reached green Italy by another volcano. The strange changes in our journey brought us to the heart of Europe. Passing the entire land under the surface, we now reached this sunny land. After the first shock, we ate and drank from that same place, and set off to find the port of Stromboli. As we did not want to frighten the native people, we presented ourselves as marines of a shipwreck. On the way to our country, my uncle kept murmuring, "The compass, the compass." He was still busy with thinking about the compass. How were we to explain the fact? The compass really did point north. "It is the best thing not to explain it, Uncle," I said. "Why not?" ejaculated my uncle. "It would be simply disgraceful. Don't you know I am a man of science?" After such a dangerous and fatiguing journey, I wonder how my uncle kept being so willing to answer scientific questions. In his ragged clothes, long hair, and beard, he looked desperate, but he was still that terrible professor at Johannam. After an hour, we arrived at the little port of San Vincenzo. Those olive trees and fresh fruits were left behind. Here, Hans demanded his wages. He shook our hands heartily, and for the first time he smiled. I don't expect everyone to believe our story. However, I don't pay it the slightest attention. The people of Stromboli received us kindly as mariners. They gave us food and clothing. We waited for 48 hours, and on the 31st of August we were taken to Messina by a small craft. There we rested for a few days and felt completely fresh. On Friday, September the 4th, we sailed on a steamer. After 3 days we reached Marseille. On the 9th of September in the evening we reached Hamburg. I cannot explain the astonishment and happiness of Groben and Martha. "Now you are a hero, Axel," said my fiancée, blushing. "You will never leave me again." I tenderly looked into her eyes when she smiled through her tears. I can't describe the extraordinary return of Professor Liedenbrock. Thanks to Martha, the news that Professor Liedenbrock had gone for a journey to the center of the earth was spread over the country. People at first didn't believe it. However, upon seeing us, they understood that she was right. My uncle became a great man then. That meant I was the nephew of a great man. Hamburg gave a great feast in our honor. At Johannam, the professor was given a public audience at which he told all the details of our expedition. He was only unable to explain the unexpected behavior of our compass. On the very same day, he deposited the famous document of Saknussemm in the archives of the city. The world of science was questioning the matter of central heat. The geologist who envied the success of my uncle was in opposition to our discoveries. While these questions were being vehemently debated, my uncle had to leave one of his real friends. Despite all of our insistence, our faithful Hans had to leave Hamburg. He was the man to whom we owed all of our success and our lives. How many times he saved me from falling down or being thrown overboard. He bade goodbye and sailed for Iceland. We would never forget our silent hunter, no matter how far away he would be. Without this skillful man, we would certainly have died. To conclude, I can say that the journey to the center of the earth created a wonderful sensation in the world. The leading newspapers spared the most interesting pages for our discovery. Our great story was discussed, attacked, and supported with great enthusiasm in newspaper columns. My uncle enjoyed the deserved glory. A distinguished scientist named Mr. Barnum offered him the honor of touring on the most advantageous terms in all the principal cities of the United States. Among our glory and honor, there was only one question to be answered. One thing still remained a mystery. For my uncle, that unexplained phenomenon was an unbearable matter. My uncle kept the compass to be worked on later. One day, while arranging a collection of minerals, I noticed this compass in the corner. We had long lost sight of it. It had been in that corner for 6 months. All of a sudden I discovered something and uttered a cry of surprise. "That compass!" "Well," said my uncle, "see, its poles are reversed." "Reversed?" "Yes, they point the wrong way." My uncle attentively looked and examined the compass, After a few minutes, the house shook with his cry of astonishment. "Look here! After our arrival at Cape Saknussemm, the north pole of the needle began to point to the south instead of the north." Evidently.
"Now I have found out the explanation for our mistake. We thought we had reached our starting point, but we were wrong."
"But why were the poles reversed?" "The reason is clear, my uncle," I said.
"Tell me, Axel."
"During the electric storm on the Liedenbrock Sea, that ball of fire magnetized all the iron particles on board. Remember? That time it reversed the poles of our compass."
"Aha! Aha!" shouted my uncle with a loud laugh. "So it was just an electric joke!"
From that day on, the professor was more glorious as he had solved all the unanswered questions of our journey. As for me, I was the happiest man on earth. My pretty Groben married me and became the young lady of our house in Koningsstrasse. Now, Professor Otto Liedenbrock, the distinguished mineralogist, became both her and my uncle. All of our adventures, whether related to science or love, ended well.